This motherfucker be killing niggas just to do it. You see? Nigga kill motherfuckers just cause he can. Not cause they snitching. Not cause it's business. But cause this shit just come natural to him.
Yo, Bodie, man.
I mean, Lil Kevin is gone. This nigga don't feel nothing. And all them motherfuckers in them row houses, nobody mean a fucking thing
Bodie,
to
I think
him.
you need to calm the fuck down.
Fuck Marlo, man. Fuck him. And anybody that think it's all right to do people this way.
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. Hello once again to Caught on the Wire. We're here for the very last episode of Season 4, its final grades. We have finally reached the very end of this amazing and very emotional season. And I'm joined as usual by Toby Huntingford. Toby, you're looking forward to the final episode and obviously our transition into the final season even of the show as a whole.
Yeah, it's a real mixed emotions, isn't it? We're getting so close to the end now. Just by chance, I do have the honour of trying to navigate us through this very, very busy episode. And I believe that as somewhat of a silver lining, we don't have any mail to read out this week, which can only be a good thing on such a potentially hefty episode.
It's a silver lining in terms of the exposition of the podcast.
But a bit of sweetness otherwise.
Exactly,
definitely.
yeah. But I think we had so many last week that it was only fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So, shall we get ultra keen and just jump straight into it?
Yeah, ready to press on. So tell us about the recap.
Yeah, we're going to have to
this
give you guys a briefing on what's going to happen because we're going to have to put in some emergency measures. Obviously, the number of strands is really going to hike up. So just to go through them, we're going to start with homicide. We're going to go through to major crimes. We're going to go see Omar. We're going to go see the New Day Co-op. We're going to go see Dookie. We're going to go see the school. Randy and Carver, Namond and Colvin. They have sort of double sections. Politics, Western District, Stanfield Organisation, McNulty, Omar, and then the closing montage. So that's certainly new for us in terms of volume. I think what's best to do here really is just to run through them one by one without any sort of idea of sections for each strand. I'm going to make an exception for major crimes, which makes up a fair bit of the meat of this episode, and also for the Stanfield Organisation. But otherwise, we're just going to be running clean through this. So, shall I jump right in at the start with homicide? Are you ready for this, Alex?
Let's do it.
Okay, so, as the episode opens, Sergeant J. Landsman walks into the homicide unit office humming a carol. His Christmas spirit is rapidly dispelled when he sees several red names being added to the case board. He quizzes Ed Norris about the board. Norris tells him that Lester Freeman is responsible, having received the go-ahead to search vacant houses for concealed bodies. Landsman is angry at the sudden drop in his squad clearance rate and calls Freeman a vandal and a Visigoth. Landsman next asks what Norris is working on and is dismayed to find out that he is also working a case without a body, that of a deliberate killing using poison narcotics. Landsman is somewhat forgiving when Norris tells him that he has the perpetrator in custody as he came in and voluntarily confessed to the crime. Norris returns to the interview room to discuss Bubbles' confession further with Landsman accompanying him. Bubbles is distraught and is undergoing withdrawal. He vomits all over the detectives and they leave the room to clean up. When they return, Bubbles has attempted to hang himself from the ceiling. The detectives cut him down. Later, Landsman is pleased to learn that Bubbles survived. He spots Detective Crutchfield leaving the unit office and is downcast once again when he learns that Freeman has found yet another body. Landsman checks with the paramedics and then quizzes Bubbles about his thinking, having mixed up the poison drugs and then confessed to the crime. Bubbles tells him the entire story behind Sherrod's death. Bubbles is filled with remorse and regret and pleads with Landsman to lock him up. Landsman tells Norris to let Bubbles go. Norris worries about losing the clearance and about Bubbles' safety. Landsman tells him to send Bubbles to rehab. Later, Keema, Greggs and Waylon visit Bubbles at the rehab centre. Waylon comforts Bubbles, but Greggs cannot bring herself to go in. So at the very start and the very end, really.
Yeah, so this is kind of the mixing up of Homicide with Bubbles' arc here. We're starting off with Landsman and his arrival at the Homicide unit then. We have more of our Christmas show rather than tell that we were talking about last week. This time, I think you mentioned it in the last episode as well, with Landsman's tie and him obviously humming a carol as well.
Pretty ironic considering what he's really walking into right here.
Yeah.
But that's how they do.
It's a nice connection of the Bubbles arc as well, which we get straight away from Ed Norris. And, that does seem to lead us nicely into the... it does seem to actually lead us into maybe one of Bubbles' saddest moments.
Yeah.
These incidents in the interrogation room. I think we've been quite critical of Bub's arc this season, but it does eventually reach a conclusion that leads us very well into Season 5 Bubbles and allows that that kind of rejuvenation in the end. I think Bubbles is looking more physically ragged than ever before, as well as all the marks of the dope fiend. He's carrying a lot of beatings with him as well. So, as we're, like you say, Landsman is feeling a bit of Christmas spirit, but that's soon crushed by the Bubbles situation and how bedraggled he appears.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, if you compare him, of course, to his efforts that he made to get Sherrod into school in the first place, where he was looking at some of his best, this really is him. They've really sort of upped the sort of scratches on his face and really sort of made sure that they've established this really bottom level visual Bubs as well as a mental Bubs, and it's a really interesting mix to have Landsman and Bubs together. Not necessarily what you'd have assumed, and to see a moment for Landsman as well. Obviously, he gets some pretty grim, noodly vomit on his shirt, but it's really cool to see Landsman taking that moment with Bubbles and seeming to feel for the poor fella. It's one of 2 times in the show where he shows this side of him, the other being Ziggy's interrogation, where we saw that tenderness that he has, and he's not a constant kind of joker. He's not just there to bring out the literature. It's great that there are those moments in the show. And of course, this does lead to one of the best Bubs scenes on the show. I think, as you mentioned, this certainly is worthy of praise, despite what we've said about Bubs this season. I think it's hard to argue that if we hadn't had a lot of setup here, it wouldn't have the same power whatsoever. And he explains so rawly and honestly what's going through his head, because Landsman literally asks him that question, and the answer he gives over the next 2 minutes is really quite something, and definitely one of the most powerful kind of speeches, soliloquies on the show. And it really feels genuine. It's clear that he's innocent, certainly to Landsman, and it's certainly an indication that he's reached that bottom that we keep referring to.
So convincing, in fact, that it takes our stalwart stats sergeant to let him off the hook.
Yes, indeed. It's very, very humbling to see that. We need those human moments, don't we, to make our characters tick, despite the fact that Landsman is normally the biggest slave to the stats. This is really, quite a touching point.
And then this follows on briefly after that, where we have Landsman's clean-up, as it were. And this is another great bit of wire-esque minutiae of the mundane. It's just kind of watching him go to the bathroom and clean himself up.
Yeah.
And we get to see the little rules graffiti, which
that's cool.
Helps in part to giving the game away on the whole rules the gay man with a starkly homophobic style of berating his inferiors.
Definitely. The only other reference we have, apart from obviously the visual appearance in the gay club, and then the Landsman has this knowing laugh, right? Obviously, it could just be an expression of anger at your boss. You'd say, oh, he's a cocksucker. But is there some real knowledge behind it? Of course, we're not going to be able to answer this question properly, but there is some delicious ambiguity there, as in many cases.
Yeah, keying into a sort of another very small story going on in the show. Just a small chance to fit it in, I guess.
Definitely, yeah. And I like, as we were referring to that Christmas tie,
yeah,
it's the tie that takes the biggest hit. That snowman's not looking very happy. So, Yeah, Christmas spirit is drowned out.
What this scene also does is it creates, it does create a very palpable gap before the the shock of Bubbles hanging.
Yeah, and it gets you off your guard, doesn't it? Certainly. Yeah. And I like, obviously there's that interrogation first, and Bubbles, he seems to be doing okay. He's clearly feeling very guilty, feeling self-loathing and wanting to really be punished for it. But as soon as they start asking him, where he got this rat poison, that's when he really goes into lockdown mode, and he's being forced into giving up the Arabas, and that's just not what the street does. He's lived in that environment all his life, and he can't handle this pressure. So it makes sense that that's the point where he kind of lose it and sort of go into this sort of mental lockdown.
Yeah, it works. It works very well, and as I say, it's one of the saddest moments. We just see him kind of crumbling and wanting to be put away. He kind of considers himself to be human rubbish. He just wants to be put away and not allowed to get out, talk to anyone, interact with anyone.
Yeah.
There's that bottom.
Yeah, definitely. Your just self-worth has reached zero. Awful. Very awful. I guess outside the emotion, it's unfortunate that Jay, you know how each... he's a sergeant, isn't he? Each sergeant that runs the homicide department, they have their own group, and all of the murders just go straight to Jay, and Jay always seems to get the crappy, huge amounts of Jane and John Does. So I did have to feel from a bit there when I saw those names being written under his column.
Oh, is this where this is where he comes in later on to see all the names going up?
No, I think it's the very first. Literally, as soon as we see his tie in the first opening shot, the camera then swings around to the board where the names are being written up, the ones that Freeman are discovering. And he's like, "Oh, Christmas spirit, Carol stopped humming. Christmas spirit dead. What the hell is that?"
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm thinking of something else that I'll bring up. That's actually part of the montage at the end.
All right, yeah.
So yeah. So after that, we have we obviously have Waylon coming back.
Yes, of course. After a very long absence, probably like 30 episodes or something from season 1. Very memorable though. I had his sort of character that would stick in your mind. I remember when I first watched it, I knew exactly who he was, sort of thing. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
And very appropriate that he should be the one who turns up when Bubbles is at this lowest point.
Yeah, and, clearly Greg's
it's really heartbreaking as well when he does turn up and see them.
Oh yeah, he's about to become an important part of Bubs' future. And of course we see this scene with Waylon from behind the glass and with a sort of semi-reflection in that glass. So you sort of get, we're sort of shielded from the full emotional heft of this scene here, despite the fact that it's already pretty heartbreaking. Waylon is almost seeming to sort of coax the bottom out of him. He needs to really, really get him there. And clearly looks like he's succeeding in that before he can then bring him up through the Narcotics Anonymous group that he'll start attending.
And Greg's, like say, couldn't bring herself to join the constellation.
Yeah, quite rightfully, yeah. And yeah, we're reminded of Greg's roots here because obviously she was very much in the pilot when they're standing over and watching Johnny as he's been beaten up. There's kind of that same solidarity between them, and Greg's has very much been moving on away from her old Cheryl and Bubs this season, so it's nice for her to be brought back in for a little bit. Yeah, so generally a very shocking opening, a very shocking homicide strand here. Unlike last week's attempt at a shocking opening, I guess, as we mentioned with Michael, this one genuinely really did bring some heft. Certainly,
and it brings the Bubbles arc to a nice conclusion. Well, nice is maybe not the right word, but it brings it to a solid conclusion and introduces us to where we will be going next with Bubbles in Season 5. So it's a good transition, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And just as a final thought, I was wondering how he got himself up there to hang himself. But then again, he was the guy who tied the cleat for McNulty back in Season 2. I like that there's...
He knows his knots.
Yeah, he knows he's not. So again, you could always find something in the show that would justify it, which is great. So there we go. On the first time round, did you think Bubs was dead when you saw that? I remember thinking that Bubs was pretty much gone at that point.
I can't honestly remember my exact reaction at the time, but yeah, they do kind of make him seem lifeless enough that you could believe it.
Unlike yeah,
I'm not an expert on the matter, but it depends how long they were in sort of trying to suggest that he had been there. I'm not sure how quickly one can die from hanging unless you drop from a great height.
Yeah, I guess it was ambiguous how long of a break Landsman had taken, and yeah,
whether
but I guess
Bubbles had done
Michael,
it straight away or sort of after a couple of minutes or something.
Definitely, but it was very shocking. Unlike last week with Michael, they clearly just sort of sprung it on you from nowhere, which really made the difference. Okay, any more on the homicide and Bubs stuff?
No, I think that's it.
All right, so we're going to go to the major crimes, and this is going to be our longest strand. We are going to go through 3 chunks here. So, firstly, Freeman marshals his team as they search vacant houses in the Western. They have uncovered 9 bodies so far in clusters around certain blocks. Greggs is there from homicide. Freeman remarks to her that the scary part of the investigation is that they are only searching a single sector of a single district. He telephones Colonel Daniels, who is at a staging area set up in the gym of a disused school. Daniels answers the call, leaving ASA Ronda, Perlman, alone to field questions from Rules and Burrell. She reports that forensics teams are attending each crime scene and they are recovering 9mm bullet casings, vacuuming for hair and fibre and laser printing for footprints. Daniels returns and is asked to confirm that the bodies are linked to one organisation. He tells Burrell that Marlowe's drug organisation is their prime focus, and is then asked what they have on Stanfield. He explains that Major Crimes was building a case against Stanfield until 3 months ago, when their wiretaps were pulled. Burrell offers Daniels whatever support he needs. Daniels tells Burrell that he needs the patrol division to begin searching houses. Daniels leaves to begin organising a citywide search. Rules then remarks to Burrell that if Daniels manages to solve this case, he will be closer to the commissioner position. Burrell tells Rules that Daniels is a long way from his job and that he is too. He taunts Rules by saying that he made his move against him too soon. Rules admits to the mistake, and Burrell warns him never to cross him again.
All right, so yeah, setting up what's happening with the major crimes here. I guess it's worth prefacing all of this analysis of the actual plot itself by saying how nice it is to see major crimes getting proper revitalisation. Obviously, there's been talk and some manoeuvres, but now we really are seeing it get back into action, and seeing as how long that detail has been gutted for and has consisted of a lot of nonsense and lack of decent leadership and truly investigative work. Nice to see them getting back up on it, and it's like having the whole crew back together again.
Yeah, I mean, McNulty's still a big hole, but there's a nice scene where they lure him in a little bit later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting to see the fruits of Freeman's relatively quick amount of labour is really, really satisfying, and kind of the heart. Well, it's not really the heart of the episode, but it certainly takes up the most time. It's sort of the dramatic focus of the episode, anyway, in terms of sort of moving the plot along and keeping things fast paced. And yeah, it's kind of cool how they're having to use a school gym to accommodate all the bodies, bring all the symbolism in, but also for practical reasons, as there's like kind of an potentially not infinite amount, but like there's sort of no idea how many they might have to bring in. Yeah, so some really cool scenes, certainly.
I do love the shot of Freeman says there's only one way to find out and calls Daniels. And then I love the shot of we have the people dealing with the bodies, and then it pulls back to Daniels' mobile phone, and then it pulls back further to his stepping away into the background, and finally we reach the presenting of Rules, Burrell, and Perlman. And it's simple but effective. It connects us to the previous scene and promptly changes setting and introduces to everything that's going on in this scene and the stakes of this big investigation and all these bodies coming out of the houses on the upper echelons of the police institution, and it does it all in one single quick movement of the camera, which I think really is fantastic. Yeah,
it's 2 scenes running simultaneously, but you only need to see one, and the other you can infer everything from, which is great, isn't it? So, yeah, absolutely great storytelling, and obviously the stuff when Daniels is away, everyone's forgotten about the gravity of what's happening, and now they're discussing their careers again, getting all those implications gossiped out of them. And Burrell, also seems to make some grudging amends with rules, or certainly makes a play back at him after being in such a compromised position for a long time. Burrell does seem to love these peaks and troughs of his sort of usefulness to the police department, and it's quite nice because Burrell's actions here indicate to us that Carcetti really has embraced Burrell, and that's that should be a grim reminder to us that firing Burrell was Carcetti's sort of number one aspiration when he joined, and that's very quickly been forgotten and dismissed. So
yeah,
it's a lot of stuff that we don't hear that's actually the most important. And rules very solemnly admitting defeat almost here. He really honestly says, I've played a bad game of politics. And I guess since Burrell does have the power back over him, I guess the only thing he can do is make amends and try and get back in someone's good books. So
yeah, it's not a very common thing to see rules admitting defeat.
Yeah. All right. So, any more on that first bit for the major crimes?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay, so Freeman receives word from Daniels and assigns Sidner and Dozeman to introduce the specifics of the search to the patrol division. Greggs asks what she can do, and Freeman asks her to raise Herc, currently suspended from duty pending the results of his internal investigation. Greggs finds Herc drinking in the morning and reluctant to become involved while suspended. She questions whether he is police or not, and he agrees to accompany her. She takes him to the site of the recent traffic stop of Chris and Snoop, as he told Freeman that he fired a nail from their nail gun into the road. They find the mark but are unable to locate the nail. Herc spends the whole time questioning why IID are investigating him when Marimo has been transferred away, and Daniels gave him a mild punishment for the incident with the minister. Tired of Herc's complaints, Greggs asks what he did as a means of reassuring him that he will have an easier hearing. When Herc admits that he falsified paperwork and a stolen camera, Greggs and her partner Bunk shake their heads in disbelief. Herc goes into further dismay, concerned that he may lose more than just his sergeant's position. Each patrol officer is given orders to search his post for the vacant houses sealed with non-HCD materials. They are instructed to report any such houses to their sector sergeant and told that they can enter, but upon finding a body they are not to disturb the scene.
Alright, so Herc, even after suspension, Herc is still trapped in this rather strange victim complex as the real police work goes on around him. And I like in the bit before it, I like Greg's incredulity at Lester needing Herc. I think I'd question that too.
Yeah, it is true. I guess that nail was the piece of evidence they needed. Herc could, he's a strong link that the witness that it was a nail that belonged to Chris and Snoop, and if they can connect that to the non-HCD nails in the doors, it would be quite an important link. But his usefulness is certainly questionable, isn't it? All the moaning he does.
And of course, they don't end up finding the nail itself. They sort of surmise that it's ended up in somebody's tire or something. So there's no connection there, and obviously we know that the nail gun itself has ended up in the river.
Yep, that is very true, yeah. So it's looking like a dead end on that front. Freeman's doing his darndest, but he's just still a bit out of his depth. He's got to do some catching up. Yeah,
I mean, we, the audience, are sitting here with sort of quite a lot more knowledge than the police themselves. It's kind of interesting that The Wire does that compared to a lot of... I mean, we kind of prefer to say that the Wire isn't a cop show, but in terms of its approach to police work, it doesn't try to make many of these reveals with us. It tends to give us the information, and then we can revel more in the characters' sort of response to these discoveries.
But you could say that there's equal dramatic value in seeing the police not, catch up.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
As there would be in discovering stuff along with them. It's just a different way of doing it. But I think it's in some ways more satisfying because it does feel like you have just a greater understanding of the show, and so yeah, it's certainly a good way of doing it. Smell the fresh derriere, of course. Old Herc's T-shirt, the Wisconsin, and it's just cool when they go on that investigation scene. There's kind of this invisible wall between Bunk and Greggs and Herc, who's just sort of there. He's sort of rattling off about himself, and the other two are carrying out their investigation. And there's just no taking Herc out of the Herc, is there? No matter how hard you try, or no matter how serious the situation gets. Despite that, he's able to really effectively summarize his mess ups. You know, he sort of gives a very, very concise overview of what happened, and it very clearly sounds horrific. Sounds like he's going to lose everything as he does. You really can't help but cackle at how ridiculous it sounds, particularly if you put yourself in Greg's and Bunk's shoes.
You think that after all of this, he's still, he might have by this point twigged on about what exactly he has done, but it feels like he will still never come to realise exactly what he did.
Yeah.
And why that was so reprehensible.
Exactly, yeah. And it almost sounds too ridiculous to be true when you hear it from his mouth, but obviously we've seen it week by week. We've seen how feasible this thing is and how it's snowballed into this awful kind of conspiracy for him, really.
At least when Herc was just kind of, out on the street doing whatever, he I suppose was an effective force in a slightly old school kind of way. But as soon as he became a sergeant, he seemed to become quite volatile as a force in the police, because suddenly he had authority and the ability to get certain resources, and being left largely to his own devices, and the detail with Marimo being there, even if he was keeping a close eye on him, to some extent Herc was still able to undertake these ridiculous plans of his, and it's been really, really unhelpful to a lot of the work and careers of the people around him. And I think it's been very fortunate that he's had the good sense to take responsibility for those things, because I think it would have been terrible to see, especially with Sidner, to see him go down with getting involved with that. Because although you could say, technically he is part of the problem, having aided him doing it, the alternative is to kind of defy the orders of your superior and put yourself in potentially even more trouble.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's a real misallocated authority here, isn't he?
Herc likes to go on about his stripes, but I think possibly the worst thing to happen to him.
Oh yeah, all of it emanates from this blowjob at the start of the season as well, doesn't it? It just shows you the foundation, the bedrock of all he's achieved is based on this blowjob. Like, it's all a big joke, really, and Herc doesn't see any of it. So we'll leave Herc to go and become a bad guy on the other side of the law now with Levy. But for the time being, he's been an entertaining, if very frustrating, presence in season 4.
Yeah, he kind of got a bit of a like a bullshit promotion for a bullshit reason, and in perhaps one of the Wire's very few twists of justice, this has not been the formation of a steady career for him.
Yeah, it's just that, climbing the ladder for Herc was just as dangerous as it would be for, sort of insubordination in other areas. Not that he wasn't insubordinate, but, it's kind of... Normally climbing the ladder would be deemed the right thing to do, but it really isn't sometimes. Okay, and then of course we get very quickly the shorthand method they occasionally use to explain the drier aspects of the police work, with the patrolman montage as Mello explains the ins and outs of the nail. It's not really cheating like they did in the first 2 seasons. They had lots of sort of musical montages throughout the first 2 seasons, if you remember, and obviously this one is just sort of a voiceover one, so it doesn't really feel like it's stepping outside the Wire's rules, as it were.
You have a rather nice bit of patrol humour going on as well, with Mello talking about this being complicated for Baltimore police. Yeah,
unless if your mama drank too much with you in the womb, there's no chance. So it's all the good banter that we like from the Western District boys. And they then find nails on the east side, don't they? Which Freeman mentions in passing. They found 4 on the east side, which of course represent the New York dealers that they didn't really need to kill, because obviously Prop Joe wanted them to make an impression. But it's nice that obviously that's again a detail that we're fully understanding of, but that the police will probably never be able to explain it. And in this scene, Freeman's using an iPad the size of a toaster, which I thought was quite entertaining. But 2006 iPad. It's certainly a sign of the times.
Yeah, it's that slightly older police equipment that we were talking about before. They kind of have it, but it's ever so slightly behind the times of, say, the FBI or something of that type.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think tablets as a working concept, I think, has been around for quite a while. But as a consumer item, I think they've only really come into their own in past 5 years or so.
Yeah, it was a bit later on, because this was the year before the iPhone, I think, and then must have been a few years after that the pads came along. But there was obviously all this equipment available from sort of specialist brands before. All right, and of course that's the scene where McNulty comes sniffing around the gym as well. The sort of case that not even he can run from. You really see more than ever that he's tempted back in. Bunk and Freeman are sort of playing a game with him that might not be the healthiest game to play if they know what's good for McNulty, but they clearly miss their police buddy and all the intelligence he provides.
Yeah, the scale of this operation has bewitched McNulty a little bit here. He's just being reeled in just enough, and of course what happens with Bodhi later on becomes that final push.
Exactly, yeah. That's what I was going to say. It's sort of it's a two-stage recipe, isn't it? You got to see the scale of it and get tantalised by it, and then obviously Bodhi gives him that almost that kind of It's almost the motivation or the guilt reason. It's sort of motivated by guilt eventually, isn't it? That he feels responsible for Bodhi and that he owes it to him.
Let's not forget, though, we also have to have. I guess we'll cover this in more detail later, but as we do with McNulty and Beatty, we have to have that moment where the character talks about making a change or looking to the future or being introspective about their past actions, and that's when things are about to get worse. Yeah,
the show has just taught us that this is how things work in The Wire, and it feels quite different when you watch it. But now that you mention it like that, it's certainly similar to the Daniels Rhonda New Day scene as well. There's a few moments where that optimism is obviously most blatant at the end of season 4 or late season 4 when things do look like they're changing.
I would think also of D'Angelo's realization with his little book club on The Great Gatsby, and him realizing overall that he doesn't want to be part of that anymore. He's going to make this change, and you feel like maybe there's a chance for him to become liberated from this world that he was so trapped by. Nope, gets murdered.
Yeah, exactly, isn't it? You have to expect it now. Okay,
and then we have it with Wallace in season 1 as well. Let's not forget.
Yeah. Everyone who gets built up for anything. I mean, we saw it with all 4 of the boys last week. We see some element of them about to make progress, and then it all comes crushing down. So, and I think they're doing it a lot more subtly with Carcetti. Obviously, there's already a lot of signs that he's abandoned his original vision, but I think it's so easy to get tied up in his problems mentally that you kind of get blinded by it like he does. But if you step outside and analyze it like we will, I'm sure we'll find plenty of flaws in his plan.
But we digress.
We are digressing a lot. I mean, there's so much. That's the thing. There's so many connections between the strands that it's just tempting to try and make all of them, but that would just leave us here all day. So,
should we do?
How about we finish off
Major Crimes Part 3?
Yeah. Okay, so Daniels convenes a meeting with the detectives. Bunk and Greggs report that Herc identified the nail gun as the same one used to nail the vacant houses shut, but that they were unable to recover the nail. Freeman suggests that the next move is to seize Chris's truck and take hair and blood samples from both Chris and Snoop. Perlman interjects, telling the detectives that they do not have the probable cause for these actions. Bunk suggests using Randy as a witness because he's able to link Chris and Snoop to the death of Lex, but Freeman insists that Randy is simply a source and didn't see anything with his eyes. Bunk becomes impatient and says that he will provide the necessary probable cause within an hour. He visits Lex's mother and pressures her into speaking up. She states that she has heard that Chris and a girl, possibly named Snoop, were responsible. With their warrant, Greggs, Freeman and Bunk effect a stop and search of Chris and Snoop. Greggs finds the wiring for the hidden glove box compartment and discovers the concealed firearms. They arrest them for the weapons charge and then have the grand jury serve a warrant for blood and hair samples once they're in custody. Back at the staging area, Daniels relays the ballistics report to Freeman. The guns found in the car are clean of prints and do not match to any shootings. Freeman suggests that a trace DNA match or a witness could break the case, but they are probably facing a lengthy investigation. Freeman asks Daniels how he chose the staging area and learns that he once went to school there.
So yeah, in our little meeting, I actually think it's earlier than this, but I'm going to mention it now because I should have mentioned it earlier. Daniel says there are 15,000 vacants in the city, which is an incredible amount.
Oh yeah, it's an astonishing number. You got to remember Baltimore's population, I believe, halved, or certainly lost at least a third from its peak in the mid-20th century. So you got to imagine a lot of houses have to be abandoned for that to happen.
Yeah, it's absolutely astonishing, and perfectly explains why they're going to need all the patrol people to make it part of their normal route in order to cover that many houses.
Oh yeah,
not exactly
definitely.
A big hit rate, is it? Where if they're going through 15,000 houses and end up with under 24 bodies.
Yeah, it is true. It's a real needle haystack effort when you think of it like that.
But they go the route of getting these hair and blood samples as a means to connect them to these scenes.
Yeah, Freeman keeps nailing this point throughout the episode, doesn't he? We've got to get the forensic stuff going. And this is the first call he's made that's really been on the ball. Of course, this will totally work eventually. Middle of season 5, it will get Chris locked up. And Chris genuinely really does look quite worried here. There sort of doesn't seem to be any poker facing going on with both Snoop and Chris actually when they're taken in for their samples, because I'm sure Chris is thinking right back to his moment where he spat over Michael's stepdad.
Yeah. And that may not have been the only incident.
Yeah, that's very true. I'm sure there's all sorts that could have, sort of traces got below the powder that they, pour over the victims and the rest of it. It's, if they're really going to go down that route, there's no guarantee that they'll be safe at all.
Not only that, but at the scale that forensics work at, I'm sure that there's no avoiding getting your spit or your sweat or your hair or something wherever you go.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
So yeah, it's a very good call by Lester, and like you say, leads to them ending up in jail.
Yeah, or Snoop, or Chris at least. It's quite crazy how the guns have no trace on them. They're very religiously wiping them down to the point where you can't catch a sniff from them.
And then we have Bunk using a sort of oft-used technique for him. He does have a certain knack for making people feel guilty. That's definitely a skill that the Bunk has, and he uses it to great effect with Lex's mother into obviously pressuring her into saying something, and they get Chris and Snoop out of it.
This is round 3 of this conversation as well. There were 2 previous occasions where he tried to get the info out of her.
Or possibly Loop, we're not sure. Could be Snoop, but it could be Loop as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you say, this is almost like a mini Bunk arc as well, isn't it? Having revisited it a couple of times before, finally he gets his answers.
And you got obviously the pressure of all those bodies hanging on your information. There's some real emotional pressure to fess up in that case, isn't there? Really?
Yeah, it's not just her son. There's a lot of people's sons in those houses being pulled out.
Yeah. Obviously, just before that, we have the dreaded moment where they all sit down and see what all they've done so far amounts to. And despite the fact that everyone knows exactly what's happened with all this, and that Stanfield's completely involved, there's no mileage in the nails, the nail gun ownership, Randy's source, or the vague patterns they've spotted with Stanfield. Despite these clear and horrific crimes, there's not actually much evidence base at all upon which it stands, and that motivates Bunk straight into action.
Yeah, Rhonda is very clear on kind of what constitutes strong PC.
Yeah, so you see how difficult things really are for the cops here. They have to really be so careful with what they gather and how they gather it. So anyway, they get their PC. It's very much a quick-moving investigation, and they go and pull over Chris and Snoop with a warrant in this instance.
That's right, yeah, they make some incredible headway, considering how far behind they've been. So they get that stop, and then we get a rather funny moment with Bunk saying that he's thinking about some pussy, to which Snoop says that she is too. And a little bit of goading later, and a little bit of attention to detail, some soft eyes from Greg. She gets that secret compartment open, and then concealed weapon finally gives them a chance to put a charge on him.
Yeah, and another lovely callback to the old school Gregs, where there's that great scene where she finds the second gun in the pilot. Certainly sort of reeked of that.
Not our only reference to the pilot in this episode.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Chris and Steve obviously getting pretty wound up, not taking this particularly relaxed by any means. If there's one thing that they don't have much experience with, it's actually being taken in by the police. They don't get caught enough, perhaps, to really know how to stand tall in these situations, but they seem to do an okay job of it. And
it's strange, isn't it? Their proficiency in avoiding the police has actually weakened their ability when faced with having been caught.
Yeah,
it's not like someone like Weebay, who was always so confident and comfortable around the police because it happened to him all the time. Whereas, although we can tell that they still have that bravado around them, Chris and Snoop seem a little more intimidated than the average person we see getting pulled over, compared to, say, Poot getting grabbed by McNulty later on.
I mean, Chris has got the right idea when the first thing he says is, those guns aren't even mine, or that truck's not even mine. It's it's rented by some little old lady, which is the first trick in the book. But beyond that, they don't have much to say. That they don't obviously play that denial card. Obviously, you have to try and play this denial facade to, sort of shake free of any possible evidence they could pin on you. But they seemed fairly reserved here when they were taken in.
And we end up in that staging area once again, and in a way, this kind of like rounds off our education theme, having had it in a school gym, and Daniel's kind of taking the time to talk to Fruin about how it used to be a school a long time ago. So and it's kind of rounding off that theme a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's really nice, and a school that's near the crime scenes as well. Obviously, we know that schools that are near these crime scenes these days don't provide you a good education for love of money, and just an indication of how things have changed, as in most institutions in the show.
And it's a rather on-the-nose point about the crime coming into the schools.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's just kind of no stopping that in the insidiousness of the street, and that, it's being brought right into the schools as well, and literally it's happening here with the school gym. So
really nice imagery, definitely.
Yeah.
And of course, they also round this strand off with the bringing in of this 22nd body, which they don't know it yet, but it's the final body to be discovered. So sort of rounds off the investigation for this season.
So anything else you wanted to point out for the major crimes as a whole?
No, that's going to be our big section, really. That I haven't got anything else to say on it. If you want, we can jump straight on to Omar.
Yeah, let's take a look.
All right, so Omar is going to be in two. I'm going to actually split his sections across the episode, so we're just going to do his first. So Omar and his crew divide up the spoils of their robbery. Kimmy is pleased with their success and tells Omar that she's going back into retirement. Omar's advisor Butchie asks how much of the shipment is left. Omar tells him that there is more than he could ever sell on his own. Butchie suggests selling it back to Prop Joe for a profit. It's initially taken as a joke, but Ronaldo and Omar begin to see the idea's potential.
It's just there's a lot of Omar cheek in this episode, but it definitely kickstarts here with the idea of selling the product they stole back to Prop Joe. But before we look at that in more detail, I would like to say that be easy is a great expression to leave someone with. I do really like that. Maybe not something I could pull off. I'd really like to sort of use that as an expression of departing, though.
Be easy.
Be easy.
I thought you meant the three letters to begin with. I was like, hang on a minute. And then, oh, right, okay.
What, B? But, Z?
I just thought... Yeah, I was like, when did he spell out the word Bez to someone? But, yeah.
I wouldn't say Z either.
Yeah, that also threw me. But yeah, no, it's a very chilled out way of going. Of course, it's an important farewell. Omar's off kind of on retirement. He's sort of hit the jackpot to the point where there'd be no point in working anymore.
To the point where he can have a bank.
Yeah, pretty much. He can be his own bank, and it's almost a new kind of problem for Omar. It's too much of a steal for him to actually sort of Robin Hood the rest of it off to the poor people, as he likes to do with the drugs that he takes. So he's going to have to find another satisfying way to use it, and Butchie's suggestion is pretty hilarious, just in concept and in execution. And you can see the immense satisfaction from Omar's point of view as Butchie sort of plants this idea in his head.
That's right. Yeah, it's a funny little idea, and so funny it just might work.
Yeah.
And it does.
Yeah, it does. It's fairly easy. I mean, we can go onto the flaws of that later on, as it's pretty much too easy, really. But our final farewell to Kimmy as well. Omar's really lifted himself up from those season 3 lows where him and Dante and Kimmy were sort of depressed together in that vacant row house for half the season after Tosha got shot. So
it's quite an ill-fated crew, really.
Yeah, it's nice that they're sort of mending those bridges, and I don't think we'll see her again, do we, in the show? But
I don't think so, no.
No.
Final montage, maybe? I feel like that's the sort of character they might slip into the final montage. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't think she appears anywhere else.
There are a few too many cameos in season 5, so it wouldn't surprise me. I think we're going to have to introduce a cameo section for season 5 as well, because like each episode has at least 2 or 3 characters that are brought back.
Yeah.
Almost just so we can sort of tie everything up and make sure that everyone remembers various other seasons. Yeah. So that's Omar Part A. Should we go and see what the New Day Co-op are up to?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Prop Joe hosts a meeting with the heads of the New Day Co-op, a consortium of drug dealers. He's in an awkward position, having had an entire shipment of narcotics stolen by Omar. He tries to convince his colleagues that they should pay for a replacement shipment while they work on recovering the stolen drugs. The rest of the co-op are dubious and tell Joe that as the drugs were in the possession of his people when they were stolen, he'll have to make up for the loss. Joe threatens to cut them off from his supplier in the future if they insist on this course, and this quiets their protests. Marlo Stanfield quizzes Joe about which of his people was there when the shipment was taken. Joe admits that it was his nephew, but tells Marlo that he will protect Cheese from any retribution. He offers to put Marlo in touch with his connection so he can reassure him that Cheese did not steal the drugs for himself. Joe discusses this course with his lieutenants Cheese and Slim. Both are dubious of the wisdom in letting Marlo meet the supplier, as they believe he'll try to circumvent them. Omar arrives at the store and faces hostility from Cheese and Slim. Joe is more pragmatic and listens to Omar's sales pitch of returning the heroin at 20 cents on the dollar. Cheese threatens to torture Omar. Joe sees the futility in this and agrees to buy the drugs. Omar collects the clock that he gave Joe to fix and pays him for the work. Joe chaperones Marlo to his meeting with Spiros. Vondas guarantees Joe's word on the stolen shipment of drugs and leaves. Marlo instructs Monk to have Vondas followed. Monk informs Marlo that Chris and Snoop have been arrested, and Marlo tells him to call their bondsman.
So, starting off with Prop Joe being quite tough with the co-op, which is interesting because we've seen him looking quite vulnerable in the past couple of episodes. It's been looking quite bleak for Prop Joe, but this ends up feeling like a reminder that he still commands authority and respect, and is able to have that supplier as leverage. But unfortunately, in his effort to placate Marlo, he essentially gives away that leverage to Marlo. And this is obviously part of what sets Joe up for his death. With Marlo now on the trail of securing the supplier, now that he knows who they are, and in season 5 he obviously ends up trying to establish links more directly through Sergei. He can eventually secure the co-op and be that kingpin of kingpins. And Slim and Cheese, in that later scene, they can see that. They can see that this is a big risk and is allowing Marlo an in. He's not really proved himself to be someone who has that kind of loyalty in the same way, seeing as he's already asking after, going after Cheese. And, Prop Joe's not there thinking, oh, well, I'm going to protect my son from a nasty talking to, or perhaps I think Marlo and his crew only really know how to do it one way. This is not someone that I think he might be too willing to trust that much, but it does end up, giving him the link to his own supplier. Big mistake.
Yeah, it's definitely his biggest mistake that he makes, isn't it? And particularly as Slim and Cheese are there, Cheese not being the brightest spark necessarily, but he is there literally predicting exactly what happens. And yeah, it's, I guess, Prop Joe is in a tight bind here. As he rightfully says, everyone is looking to blame him for this, and but it is a bit of a step too far, and a little bit like Bubbles last week. There's an element of not being forgivable because it is just a little bit of an oversight, too much.
It shows that the co-op is a bit of a facade, really. I mean, they're operating under this idea that they share and share alike, and that they're all equals, and that they bear the good times and the bad times equally. But Prop Joe is able to dispense this placation to everyone else except Marlowe, and actually makes an exception for him. And that just completely undermines the whole point of the co-op, that Marlowe is getting this special treatment, and as a result, it's allowing him to push himself into this top slot and muscle Joe out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, outside the legitimate world, there's not really a way to prove if something does go wrong that you haven't double crossed them. There's sort of not that trail of proof that there would need to be in the world that's regulated by law. So you can understand why everyone does go defensive, and really does, particularly Marlowe, of course, wants to really get to the bottom of it. It isn't very cooperative, I do agree, but I can understand why everyone gets on their guard like this. But
Marlowe is given slightly special treatment.
Yeah,
he is kind of given that little bit extra satisfaction.
Yeah,
that is not granted to anybody else in the co-op.
Oh yeah, he's clearly going for the more ambitious special treatment here. He's it's very interesting, and Prop Joe really should see the ulterior motive a lot more clearly here. Nonetheless, it's a pretty amazing scene when they have the meeting. They've ditched the hotel for some reason. Guess this one was an emergency, and we see sort of how we're literally picking up only a few minutes after the heist. Because they're sort of talking about it as if it was, very, very recent. And, it's we're seeing the whole thing begin to disintegrate here. And Joe saving it as, about as much as it can be saved. And Marlowe just being very scary. And asking for the culprit. So despite the fact that he'd be a member of the co-op, Cheese in this case, or whatever, Marlowe wants that person dead. It's very much a Marlowe protocol to eliminate problems at the source, as he did with Lex.
Yeah.
And Joe quite rightfully doesn't give him up, although he is becoming aware of these differing motivations within the group. Not everyone is seeing eye to eye by any means here. And Marlowe is still clearly more ambitious on the bloodthirst, which is something that these guys have tried to eradicate, really. So of course we bring back Fondus. Season 2.
That's right. So we kind of end up meeting him once more. Nice to see him again. I guess he kind of gets a little moment in how cautious he is. The Greeks are perhaps the most cautious of all the sort of drug organisations out there. So giving Joe a bit of a run for his money, because I think his caution there is well placed on his own nephew, but not on himself or the co-op.
Yeah, I mean, Prop Joe knows, and this is good knowledge. So it's obviously true knowledge that Joe himself will always be the most trustworthy in the Greeks' eyes. But he's totally underestimating, as most people would do with Marlowe, the brutality of the Stanfields. If death is what is needed to elevate their importance relative to Joe, that's what they'll do. They're just going to kill Joe off and then force the Greeks to play their hand, and they're going to have to hire Marlowe. They're going to have no other choice.
Yeah.
So just again, Prop Joe just completely underestimating the increased ferocity of things in the street.
We also have this scene that we've mentioned briefly between Cheese, Slim, and Prop Joe that obviously ends up with Omar arriving. This is some more cheek from Omar, like I mentioned before, where he's coming in and brazenly just offering this package back to them. And a not so subtle ticking clock theme for Joe with Omar, where he's got his clock that he goes to collect.
Yeah, that's very true. Oh gosh, and for Joe as well, really. But yeah, it's a good scene. Not quite as quippy as the previous ones in these shops. And there is this annoying aura around Omar that he can't be touched. It's this sort of superhuman feature that just isn't questioned in the show at all. He's clearly not exactly got any henchmen backing him up here, bar Ronaldo and Butchie perhaps, but they're miles away. And Spiros making, sorry, not Spiros. But yeah, it's just, Cheese obviously gets quite vocal with him, but there's no attempt to actually challenge him physically. So you do have to question how the mythos of Omar allows him to do this, really, when he's just a sack of blood and bones like the rest of them.
Well, superhuman is absolutely the right term for it, because he's even got like a costume, hasn't he, with his duster and his bulletproof jacket and everything. Like, it is kind of like a superhero costume and cape and everything.
Yeah.
So
that's very true.
The larger than life thing continues, and like you say, he comes across as untouchable, and even going so far as, of course, I'll pay you for the work that you've done whilst I've finished exploiting you and extorting money after stealing from you. But here's $20 for your good work on my clock.
Yeah, it is fantastic.
I mean, why on earth? Why Omar sort of really needs this ornate clock back is kind of besides the point. He's literally just doing it to fuck with people, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's just in case someone's snapping pictures. He's got a legitimate reason and motive to be in there if he brings a clock with him.
I suppose there's that as well.
Yeah.
But if someone's snapping pictures of them, they're probably doing it for a good reason. They probably got at least something on them. And also, he's wearing a big duster with a big flak jacket sort of thing, so not exactly incognito.
Yeah.
Let's go down and see my mates at the repair shop kind of attire, is it? Not necessarily incriminating, I suppose, but...
it makes Namond's hair look like a camouflage, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Just quickly going back to that Spiros stuff, there's the bit, obviously, where Spiros tries to prove to Marlowe that it wasn't Joe, and he doesn't really have a way of proving it. You sense he obviously just says, I look into people's souls and I am the arbiter of honesty and the rest of it. And there's this kind of magic that he believes in that you kind of see from him. There's this sort of European mystique, I guess, about him.
Oh yeah, mystique, certainly, yeah. It's
the word, isn't it, really? And that kind of goes a long way to legitimizing those things that he says, and he says them throughout season 2 as well. But you almost sense that Marlowe's already forgotten the whole thing about the setup and is now looking ahead at getting involved with this guy. He's clearly fascinated by him, sees the power that he holds, and he's realizing more and more how he's not really wearing the crown yet, despite how much power he feels like he must wield. And of course, he just puts Monk straight on him. Start tailing the guy, and
start unraveling some of this Greek mythology.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. And Marlowe, of course, after that is very happy to spill out his share. Is it something like $100,000 he has to pay to cover his share of the loss?
I'm sure that's not a serious chunk out of his checkbook.
Not at all. But it's interesting how obviously he's suddenly very, very open to this and completely, apparently, believes Spiros. So, yeah. So obviously, overall, Prop Joe, hands are tied. He's kind of making some mistakes, but if he didn't call this meeting and put across this point, I think the co-op would have gone pear-shaped far quicker than it actually does. So he does buy himself some time.
Yeah, sort of starting with a bit of authority, but ultimately still coming out pretty weak and vulnerable, and things still not looking any rosier for him, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's always the much-loved characters.
Yeah, unfortunately so. Prop Joe was just such a legend. I mean, he still is, but he doesn't feel like he's got that sort of evergreen wisdom to him, because you can see the cracks in his logic now.
So
all right,
that must be about it for the co-op then.
Yep. So we're just going to go and see Dookie for a little bit. So Dookie arrives home and overhears his friend Michael having sex with a girl. He goes to attend his first day of high school, but changes his mind on the way there. Dookie visits Prez at school and gives him a gift. Prez tells him that he can stop by any time.
Yeah.
So we get to see the awful wreck of Randy's house from Dookie's perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say there's that kind of very small bit where he just kind of observes the burnt-out house, which I don't know. Why was that there? I don't know. I'm not necessarily like wholly against it, but is it just a reminder?
It's weird. Obviously, it's Randy's house. It looks almost like Dookie's because all the furniture's outside, but I don't know whether someone has looted it and thrown the furniture out or whether it was the authorities that did that, but everything's obviously burnt up and looking pretty sorry for itself, and we're reminded here how Dookie is like literally a drifter now. We see him throughout different patches of the episode sort of drifting through the streets without a real home to go to now. It's just really sad. And he's very alone, but he seems quite used to it as well. There's no sense of fear or stress on his face. He seems very vacant. And overall, he's just very fortunate that Michael's taken him under his wing, even if he doesn't appear to enjoy spending much time with him anymore.
I suppose. I mean, I don't. Obviously, he kind of ends up as a bit of a drifter, but I think at this stage, he's sort of still yet to have his first day at school, where he obviously decides that he's not going to go, and then he very much does end up as a drifter. But I suppose here he's just giving us a up-to-date observation on the burnt-out house.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a very minor reminder. And then he comes home to Michael's house. Michael obviously just having sex with some random girl. I don't think we know who it is. It's just some random person. I don't know why I remembered it at this moment, but I remembered that Michael or Tristan Wilde's the actor who plays him. He's in the music video for Adele's new song.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, he's got a prominent role as the love interest, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some sexy stuff goes on in that, I imagine.
Yeah, maybe that's why.
Yeah, got a bit of deja vu.
I don't really remember it, to be honest.
Yeah. So we see obviously Michael's really it's lovely and fortunate for Dookie and Bug that he takes them in. He has their own room as their bunk room, but he's also very much focused on his gangster stuff, and he's not really necessarily the most. I mean, he's certainly loyal. That's one word that you can always say for Michael, but he's not necessarily sort of the warmest of friends. You wouldn't have thought. Not to take away from Michael at all, but that's just kind of his character.
I was going to say it's certainly fortunate for Bug because his concentration on what's going on with the Stanfield organisation does leave him apart from Bug quite a bit. It's interesting that he's taken all of these steps to protect Bug and to take him away from the father and to get their own place, and now he's kind of just leaving it to Dookie.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of fortunate for Bug there that it does feel like a gap is being filled. And then I suppose Dookie does end up going for his first day of high school, but never quite makes it. Some taunting out on the pavement ends up sort of pushing him back. Just doesn't want to have to face it alone. Doesn't want to have to deal with all of that stigma all over again. It took him so long to get to a position that was at least a little bit comfortable, a little bit safer, accepted by the people around him, and in the comfort of a teacher who understood and cared, maybe a little bit too much, but at least cared. When he does return to this person, to Prez, it seems like maybe Prez has actually taken on some of Miss Donnelly's advice and has distanced himself. He does kind of, offer her, you can stop by any time, but it doesn't have that same level of genuine, heartfelt, I will do anything I can to help you style that it had before. I think he understands that it's time to move on.
Yeah, and it is sad when you see how much Dookie would really benefit from some dedicated help in the way that Randy and particularly Namond get, of course. Even Michael's mentor has stuck by him, which I guess we call Chris. But Dookie is the one who, by Prez's choice, really does have to be abandoned and sort of kept at arm's length. And the scene with Prez is very sort of reminiscent of their next scene, which is at the end of season 5. It's the same spot outside the same school, the same slippery slope of lies that Dookie is telling to Prez, and so tragic how Dookie is sort of trying to clutch on here to the biggest comfort in his life so far, the only friend who he finds relatable, I guess. As I was saying about Michael, he's not, the warmest of friends in terms of a bonding way, perhaps. That would certainly be my interpretation. And the smile that he gives when he sort of sees Prez finally comes outside the school to meet him, is just like really quite tragic when you see sort of how much he really clings on to Prez emotionally.
Yeah, it means a lot to him. When Prez ends up seeing him later dealing on a corner, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Maybe he felt a little bit guilty for not, welcoming him with open arms like he might have done.
Yeah. It's a tricky situation, definitely. And he ditches the oversized coat, of course, so... But yeah, so very sad segment there. Dookie, it's hard to say who ends up the worst, really, of the four kids. You can make an argument for Dookie, I think, certainly, by the end of season 4, this is. And of course, Michael, we see here taking a sort of very metaphorical step, or I guess you could say thrust, away from innocence here in the bed, sort of completing the cycle that these kids have gone through from the Boys of Summer.
That's right, yeah. It's certainly Dookie started the worst and maintained a pretty awful situation, not obviously of his own doing, for the whole season. May not have necessarily ended up the worst, however you intend to frame that. I don't really think that tragedy is a competition, but if you are going to sort of try and order them in any way, arguments can certainly be made for strongest for Randy or Dookie.
Yeah, I think Michael as well is in the argument as well. It depends on. Obviously, he's got people that look out for him, but they're sort of in some people's minds the worst possible influences as well. So.
Yeah, it's kind of a different kind of terrible situation.
Yeah, they're sort of destroying his mind and destroying his emotional relationship with the world, pretty much. So, yeah, it's very obviously Namond is the one who gets away, but the other three, I think you can really make a case for either of them.
So should we move on to our next strand?
Yeah, so we're going to go see the school. There's not a lot with the school this episode, really. A lot of it is sort of spilled out into the individual segments for the kids. So Prez invigilates as his class take the statewide tests. Calvin refuses to begin the test, but most students are working hard. In the special class, the majority of the students are not participating, but Namond, Zenobia, and Darnell are attempting. Colvin announces the cessation of the special class to the students. The majority are pleased, but Zenobia is reluctant to return. Prez receives the test results and is pleased to learn that over a third of his students are classified as proficient. Miss Sampson grounds him by explaining that a score of proficient means reading at a level 2 grades below the student's age. Prez admits that he is still learning, and Sampson tells him that he's going to be fine. Prez welcomes the special students back to class. Only Albert makes a disruptive comment, but he is stared down by his peers.
So, yes, we have the test going on. It's interesting that in the special class it's our 3 restaurant goers that are the only ones trying the test. There is an emphasis placed on the fact that they were picked out for a good reason, and sure enough, they are making the effort. They seem the most ready to return to their normal classes out of all the people there.
Yeah.
But even in the normal classes themselves, there are students that are just not even entertaining the test at all. Calvin obviously refusing to do anything on his paper whatsoever.
Yeah, there's still problems, certainly. I like that you can very clearly see, more so than I think other episodes, who Snoop's sister is that Namond refers to earlier on in the season. She's got kind of the same hairstyle, just the younger, less fierce-looking version of Snoop near the front of the class.
Yeah.
And of course, these scenes sort of make up that titular final grades moment. And the kids seem to be doing a pretty capable job of actually observing the exam conditions. They're not going to try too hard to mess things up. And yeah, it seems like these kids are using it as a moment for quiet reflection rather than actually examining their knowledge. But there we go.
And with our literal final grades themselves, we have both Prez and us discovering that we should be happy about the fact that, a third of them are reading at a level 2 grades below their age. And that's kind of considered to be good going.
Yeah.
And I also feel like when Samson tells him that he's going to be fine, we do believe it, because this is followed up by a very kind of strong performance from Prez as a teacher in the class, seeing how far that we've come from that first episode where he obviously just couldn't really handle them at all. And there's a feeling that having the corner kids, as it were, separated from the class and in the special class, that with them now having returned and these other kids getting used to the fact that those disruptive ones have been out of the class, it feels like they are not only more receptive to Prez as a teacher, but less tolerant of that kind of disruptive behaviour, which obviously leads Albert's rather rubbish worst nightmare coming back on you comment to not get any kind of response whatsoever.
Yeah, he doesn't attract any laughter, does he? So there's a lots of suggestion that Prez commands more authority now, and it makes sense. It's another cycle that's completed. Sort of Prez has had his first term in school and has settled down quite nicely. And of course, when Miss Sampson provides this real, more so than any other, real duking the stats, kick in the teeth, like it's a real horrible manipulation of the actual facts, Prez just doesn't seem frustrated by it. He seems to accept it and says, I'll get used to it. It's this complete mind state, and he's become the teacher that he should be, I guess. He's the one that actually functions within the system, not necessarily for the McNulty right reasons, but for the reasons that are set out, necessitated by the way it works. So he's kind of within this system now, and he's not thinking too heavily about helping the kids out on an emotional level. He's not thinking too hard about what's wrong with the system. He's now just sort of inside it and working with it more functionally.
I suppose we've already seen that Prez is capable of, going along with the system to some extent. Although he is obviously a teacher, he's not really like a leader in the sense that, say, a kind of progressive leader in the way that McNulty is, like you say, trying to push for what he thinks is right and change the system from within. It makes me think of season 1, where Prez is very much following the lead of those around him and behaving in that way. You do get a sense that that is not genuinely Prez. He is kind of like just going along with what he perceives to be the system. And he's doing the same thing here in season 4, but the results are actually a bit more positive, and he's not blinding any children, he's actually teaching them.
Yeah,
which is obviously preferable.
He's certainly got his aspirations and his ideas of how the world should work, but he's not self-destructive in the slightest. He is, he's certainly a self-server, as most people are at the end of the day, and that certainly puts him on a massive wavelength against McNulty. So pretty cool. I like how obviously we see the test being taken across both the classrooms that we've gotten to know. With Prez, he's disappointed because the kids aren't motivated to even do the test in a lot of instances. Whereas with Colvin and Parenti, the frustration comes from the fact that the test is sort of so irrelevant to these kids. It's a complete waste of time. And it sort of flies in the face of everything they've been trying to build over the season. It's an awful way to finish the special class, really. And very heartwarming how Namond sort of says, this was I. No need to rise to that peer pressure anymore. He's speaking with more honesty. He's not afraid of being talked down by the rest of them.
Yeah, a lot of change. It's sad to see Colvin's frustration with it all near the end, which obviously we'll come into in more detail. Is that he's actually had more of an impact than maybe he realises, and that it has changed a lot of people's attitudes. It has had a genuine effect on that classroom. Like we were saying about maybe the kids have become less tolerant of that kind of behaviour now that it's been out of the classroom for such an extended period of time. And also, it's had a very significant impact on Namond, which it certainly wouldn't have done without. So, I think the impact that these programs and these changing attitudes have had on the classroom is, when you think back to our Boys of Summer, the difference is like night and day.
Definitely, yeah. So I think as far as the strands this episode go, the school is definitely one of the most positive that we get to experience, along with the
Such as it is.
Yep, it's still got its bittersweet moments, but the school and the Namond and Colvin chapters are kind of the real positive developments this week, and the rest of it's fairly grim. So in light of that, should we go and see what Randy and Carver are up to? They're very much a double act this episode.
All right, speaking of grim, then.
All right. So, Ellis Carver desperately tries to find somewhere suitable for Randy to stay following the firebombing of his previous home and serious injuries to his foster mum. He's insistent that Randy cannot go back to a group home. Lieutenant Mello is unsympathetic and tells Carver to take what is on offer. Carver visits the social services offices personally and tries to convince them to put Randy at the top of the list for foster placement. Carver offers to foster Randy himself, and the department tells him that he needs to go through 3 months of screening before he can take custody. At day's end, Randy is still sleeping on the bench in Carver's office. The next morning, Mello gives Carver an angry tirade when he discovers Randy and orders him to hand him over to DSS. Randy offers Carver his savings to bribe someone for a foster place. Carver drops Randy off at a group home. Randy offers him forgiveness and gratitude for his attempt to help. Randy is met with contempt from his new cohabitants. Carver leaves completely frustrated and vents his anger in a tantrum in his car. So Carver trying all he can to make sure Randy's okay, skipping the roll calls for a couple of days on the trot for this kid. This responsibility is hanging heavy on his shoulders. He must feel very responsible for the firebombing and for all the stuff that happened before. He's sort of been involved for a lot of the snowball effect that's sort of started from nothing and worked its way into something very, very serious with Randy. And battles with the bureaucracy of another institution that we're yet to see, the sort of social services waiting list. You get the sense that every single person trying to get on there will try and fight their case for how they're different to everyone else and deserve to be at the top and have their own personal tragedy. But you see how difficult it must be if you're working on the other side of that desk and you have to kind of distance yourself from all those stories and just look at it as a list and as a process. And it's frustrating for Carver. You can see it, but you can also see the other side. So yeah, very, very frustrating to watch.
Yeah, very tough. Carver obviously making up that difference, having somewhat failed him before. And yeah, you're right. I think it's not going to come to much in an institution like that where pretty much every single kid who comes through the doors has probably got a very legitimate reason why they could be considered particularly tragic or particularly special or whatever. So yeah, very tough decisions to be making, and we can see that experience, if you like, on the face of the lady behind the desk.
Oh yeah,
not going to be budged.
She's heard this every day before, and she's just sort of had to close herself up to it, I imagine. And then of course we get the bribery as sort of the next option potentially.
Oh, it's very very sweet of Randy to offer, what is it, $230 odd as a bribe.
All of his sweet earnings over the years. Most of it's obviously probably piled back into the resupply, but
if Clay Davis is to be believed, there are no bribes.
Yeah. Well, I was just about to mention Clay Davis as well. Under the opposite circumstances, I was going to say that up here in the legit world, away from the street, unless you're some sort of Clay Davis figure, there's even fewer ways to actually resolve things in the legitimate world because the bribes won't work. But yeah, if Levy and Clay Davis are anything to believe by, there are no bribes.
Yeah,
apparently,
according to the master of bribery. Well, it's not really bribery, is it? Because you pay him money and he does nothing, so it's just kind of...
It's just extortion.
Yeah, it's just straight up extortion, thievery.
Yeah. Oh dear.
So yeah, this culminates in Randy ending up in the rather horrible group home eventually. He does offer his forgiveness to Carver, which obviously I think Carver is quite surprised about, but perhaps it's a very, very light relief to how heavy his heart must be on the whole subject. But when he leaves, it's not enough, and I think that his kind of outburst in the car is very tragic indeed.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of big 3 or 4 scenes this episode that are very memorable. They'll stick with you, and the sort of emotional climax, definitely, or one of them, of many for this episode.
Yeah, I mean, we know Carver well. We know his, the progress that he's made, and we know how he means to do very well. And there's just nothing he can do here at all.
Yeah, and it's a really well set up emotional outburst as well. The scene where they take him into what looks like a very, very nice building, actually, a very historic building, and actually inside is a very ugly situation. Some horrible domestic dysfunction going on. There's very little concern from the staff by the looks of it, who just march him in and don't pay or bat an eyelid to the actual sort of implicit intimidation that's going down already, even before Randy's sort of walked into the room. So
there's a very hostile atmosphere being tolerated there.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they've tried to stop it, I'm sure, but there's only so much they can do. And of course, very gut-wrenching of Randy to say, you tried, don't need to feel bad for me, which is said with quite an ounce of sarcasm and sort of hardened undertone as well. It almost feels like the season 5 Randy that we see in yet another cameo. But for the first time, it feels like Randy isn't really being genuine here. It's sort of perhaps something that he's been trained to say as a polite boy by Miss Anna, but he really doesn't feel it in this case. He feels failed, as you cannot blame him for.
So anything else on Randy? And obviously his pretty tragic end, and like you say, not the last that we see of him.
No, we'll see the full product of his time here a few episodes later, but I think that's it for Randy and Carver.
Right, what's next?
So we're going to move on to slightly lighter things with Namond and Colvin, the other double act, although no less emotional, but sort of the other scale of the emotions. So Cutty is recuperating following a fracture of his leg in a shooting. The nurse believes that Cutty is a gangster, having reviewed his medical records. Colvin arrives and asks Cutty for help with Namond. They meet again later, and Cutty reports that Weebay Bryce has agreed to meet with Colvin. Cutty tells Colvin that Carver now owes him a favour. On his way out, the nurse asks Colvin when they are arresting Cutty, and he relays that Cutty runs a community gym. Colvin visits Weebay in prison. Weebay recognises him from his time as a patrol officer. Colvin tells him that he is now a sort of teacher rather than a police officer. Colvin tells Weebay that Namond is a bright boy with a lot of potential, but that he will not survive life on the streets. Weebay believes the risks of the game will determine Namond's fate, but Colvin convinces him that Namond's nature has a large part to play. He asks Weebay to give him custody of his son. Colvin picks Namond up from school, where he is being watched by Miss Duquette and Dr. Parenti. He tells his colleagues that he believes that Weebay will return Namond to his mother. Parenti states they have a meeting at City Hall. Colvin is nervous about meeting with the mayor because of his history with the police force, but finds that Carcetti will not be in the meeting. Andy and Jerry are skeptical about the technique, characterizing it as tracking and leaving a subgroup behind. Colvin claims that the children are already being left behind and laughs about the system's refusal to admit its failings. Andy brings the meeting to a swift close. As they leave, Colvin berates his shortcomings in the political arena. Parenti blames the failure on the process and seeks consolation in his academic findings. Meanwhile, Weebay tells Delonda Bryce that if she has thrown Namond out, then he will stay out of her care. Delonda claims that she is trying to harden Namond, and Weebay threatens that if she does not let their son go, he will use his reputation against her. She asks Weebay if he is cutting her off, and he reassures her that their marriage is not over.
So the very first thing that we see in this strand is the guy next to Cutty watching Deadwood.
Yeah.
It almost felt like a bit of a dig at Deadwood, didn't it? And obviously known for its high frequency of swearing. A lot of very colourful swearing.
I think it was more of a dig at the guy watching Deadwood, because there was they got him, cocksucker. I don't know if they're clearly trying to take the piss out of a certain type of viewer. Perhaps they're taking the piss out of these sort of network shows where you can't swear at all, you have to bow to the advertising standards or whatever, but I felt like it was more taking a poke at the guy or the demographic of that guy than anything else. But yeah, it was a cool little reference.
And Cutty's still shaking off his past, still not entirely got away from him despite the changes that he's made.
Yeah, and of course they like to draw those weird comparisons with the guy next to him who gets like all the television channels because he paid some insurance. It's crazy that the medical care has all these tariffs to it, like all the work Cutty's done to deserve the best treatment, and the reality is the world's never going to stand up and take notice. He's certainly being reminded of that here.
Yes, what of the terrible things that he's done though?
What's that, sorry?
What of the terrible things that Cutty has done though?
Oh, that's true. That's true, but can reform forgive all past misdoings, I guess? That's the question.
I guess it's also a sort of sort of country-specific thing.
Yeah.
Sort of paying for these packages and extras and whatnot.
Yeah. It's certainly something that it's alien to me, certainly.
But this ends up going to Weebay, and Weebay is no doubt struggling with this decision that Colvin is presenting him with, even though Colvin does present a rather bittersweet argument as he talks about making things happen for Namond that never were for him or Weebay. So I think he knows how to approach this argument with Weebay, even though he's non-committal at the time.
Oh yeah, it's the Weebay chat is a very powerful scene, certainly. Weebay sees a lot of reason here, doesn't he? Like, there's no one left for him to stand for. I guess Weebay is known on the streets by the dinosaurs, by the Bodies and the Cuttys, but the streets have quickly forgotten him, we could imagine. Weebay hasn't got anyone left to stand tall for. That would kind of ruin your motivation and your sense of worth. And it makes sense that he sort of loses all connections and a sense of purpose as a gangster. And that's sort of that's kind of how I rationalise that he would actually sort of be open to this idea. It's certainly very forward-thinking for Weebay, who's not been the most savoury character throughout the show. I mean, he's done some pretty horrible things. So that he sort of, remember when he raped that semi-dead hooker in season 1, stuff like that. It's been some, and obviously the second highest murderer behind Chris Partlow. But he's clearly here, and as you say, Colvin's putting himself on Weebay's level. He's sort of putting them in the same category. Things haven't worked out for you and me, which is an incredibly humbling thing for Colvin to say. But we can change that for Namond. Namond is showing promise and can put himself out there in the world in a way that was never possible for our kind. So very selfless ambition, warm feelings he has for Namond here, very emotional.
Yeah, definitely. I think that also with what you were saying before, on top of the fact that he has no one to stand with and he's losing motivations in that sense, also just the time in prison has come to realise, what it really is, and even he can see that he doesn't want to, doesn't want his son to end up in that position, and that's at the, pretty much the best case scenario that Colvin presents, is that he might, if you're very lucky, end up in prison. But what's more likely, he's very honest about it and says that he reckons within a matter of, months to a couple of years that Namond will be dead. Yeah,
and he explains very clearly how the streets have changed, and Namond may have survived a lot longer in the times of more honour when Weebay was around. But they use the idea of a history as they sort of swap these old stories to demonstrate how much things have changed. And you can't really imagine the current street arrangement out there allowing for any sort of maintenance of this culture that they're discussing, and these old memories, war memories that they have actually. As Colvin literally says, it's dead, man. Like, the street is dead. Any sense of respect is gone, and Namond is not cut out for that world in any sense. And it certainly gets through to him. And I think it's arguably the best conversational scene of the season, or of the episode, certainly. It proclaims the point that this season's trying to make, I think, more clearly than any other, sort of most clarity of it. And we have occasionally referenced the TV critic, who has done a podcast series on this show. He's done one episode per season. This was the only scene in the show that made him cry. So it certainly does have some really emotional resonance for some viewers.
Yeah, it's very, very strongly bittersweet, and just wonderfully performed, and it is good to see Weebay again because I think he is a very good character. If it weren't for him being in prison, and as you've already stated, he is a pretty certainly during his time he was brutal and really quite nasty in a lot of his acts and uncaring, dispassionate, etc. He is still a compelling character and well performed, so it's good to see him playing a part in this very powerful scene in a very powerful episode.
Oh yeah, definitely. And two whole seasons for Colvin of disappointments, trying to build something and never getting anywhere. This is the one success story he has, and in many ways it's sad because it's what Prez needs more than Colvin in some ways perhaps, but Colvin's retiring and all that, he has the time and the motivation for this. And he's going to be taking Namond on as a foster child, so quite the development.
And so Colvin moves on from here to this meeting that he has with, at City Hall, what he believes to be with the mayor, but it obviously discovers that it's not, as we know that Carcetti is off to Annapolis. The whole idea of this program is instantly dismissed by Steindorf and Jerry, and they're just like, no, this is tracking. So it doesn't end very well. I think Colvin is obviously very frustrated about the fact that they're probably in there for 5-10 minutes. And then we see his perspective on the academic side and academia in general. And this feels like part of, or a very small part of one of the show's messages, which is kind of about the lack of connection between the experts and the action in the real world, and this comment on studying other people's studies. And Colvin's perspective on this is, how much of this is creating actual change and how much of it is kind of self-indulgent. It almost feels like that could have been another institution in the show as a whole, is academia and it protecting itself and it wanting to reward itself, and kind of in a similar way that the newspapers are in season 5 with their awards and their kind of big head-turning stories rather than quality journalism. So it feels like the academia could have been part of that as well.
Oh yeah, it's as Colvin puts it, what they're going to do, they're going to study your study, and it does make a bit of a mockery of the academic world, and just guess his ultimate criticism is of the distance between theory and practice, and how studying is not necessarily actually going to change anything on the street. And for a practical, hands-on man like Colvin, you can totally see why that's the assumption he'd make and the conclusion he'd draw. Not sure if that's the show's stance on it as well, but it certainly reflects on Colvin. And then of course he's very much begrudging of that when he has to sit through one of Parenti's kind of academic, TED Talks or whatever at the end.
I mean, if we do kind of approach the idea of the biases that The Wire has in kind of the way that it's presenting all of its themes, it does seem that academics are never portrayed in a particularly honourable light. There is this emphasis on the jargon and a sort of self-serving principle rather than... Parenti never comes across as this sort of person wanting to bring about good things through research or whatnot. There is just a kind of common, constant self-serving element to it. So I think that maybe there's a slight bias in the show's demonstration there, and that academics are slated quite heavily throughout.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme of that. I mean, The Wire is generally very good at being impartial and just stating facts, but I completely agree with you, it does feel like the academics do take a bit of a one-sided bashing here.
I mean, we kind of get it later on in the montage, don't we? Like you've already mentioned it, it's like a sort of like a TED Talk. I mean, Colvin is not particularly interested in Parenti's ERGM coefficient distributions or whatever it is that he's got in that PowerPoint. It's like this sort of weird nexus of lines and symbols with sort of big words like, coefficients and random access distribution.
Does seem a little bit grandiose for the special class to be expressed in those terms. That's just. Maybe Parenti did find a way to quantify things like that, but
epidemiologically speaking, of course.
Yeah, absolutely, and no other way.
How else could it be described? But yeah, you're right. I mean, the academics get a bit of a beating in this show.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. So that's that. Obviously, we get the dismissal, the tracking dismissal that you mentioned. Did make me wonder, of course, how much more of a look Carcetti would have given this scheme if he were there. Imagine a tracking. I can imagine that Steintorf will give Carcetti a briefing on what tracking is, and then he'd be talked out of it again. But if you really want Carcetti to actually be the change that he wanted to be, to discuss the real issues all along, you'd have thought that Carcetti would really need to pay something like this attention. But the fact that he's obviously skipping out on these smaller meetings for his more self-centered governor stuff, further evidence that he's already losing sight of what it means to actually fix the city, and he's finding ways to rationalise that to himself, as we'll get on to.
He could have presumably rescheduled this meeting.
Yeah.
But no, it was just presented to Steindorf and Jerry instead, and it's very quickly stonewalled.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get the scene with Delonda and Weebay, which is a real cheering for Weebay moment, I think. Absolutely. And he really gives Delonda that satisfying comeuppance we've been looking for, I think, all season.
Yeah. It's her whole reasoning behind the treatment of Namond is laid bare here. About this idea
really?
of, I was just trying to make him hard enough for the street, which obviously is just, a load of nonsense, really.
Yeah, it's just a bit sadistic, really, overall. It's the main reason.
It's demonstrates what a sham her idea of parenting is. And although when we talk about Namond kind of coming out very much on top in terms of the other kids, and him being very fortunate in his position, although some might complain about the fact that Namond wasn't really deserving of that kind of fortune. If the Wire's taught us anything, it's that deserving things has very little to do with it.
Yeah, as Snoop says, literally.
Exactly. Yeah. So, if anything, this does show that he is at least getting away from the terrible poison that is Delonda Bryce.
Yeah. And, of course, for Weebay as well, we sense that he's gotten away from whatever poison it was he was tied down with before. He's really come up. Prison seems that it can be a real place of repentance. And there's, again, it's all conjecture, really, but you get the sense that without Avon around, Weebay has sort of lost his sense of purpose and sort of seen the light about a different way to live, really, beyond what being a gangster means and the rest of it. So very, very open-minded for him to suggest this and to completely force Delonda into the corner over it. And he's come a longer way than most, as we were saying before, all the crazy stuff he's done.
And I believe this is the last time we see Delonda.
Yes, that's right.
I don't think we don't get any kind of cameo or anything from her as season 5. This is the last time we see her, thank goodness.
Yeah, jeez. At least she has a slightly positive ending. And we will see Weebay one more time when he sort of meets up with Chris when he's thrown in jail, which is a really cool moment. The two heavy murderers sort of convening.
Yeah, the ultimate meeting of the ultimate enforcers.
Yeah. Interesting how Cutty's dismissive of Colvin. Sorry, we're backtracking suddenly, but we didn't talk about Cutty and Colvin because obviously it's an interesting meet of characters that don't normally meet, and Cutty's obviously very dismissive of generally police characters. I guess that's what he's always been used to be doing. Despite going legit, this kind of ingrained non-cooperation with the police just running through him, and he's not willing to put in Monk or Michael or anyone to Colvin here, not just because it could come back on him, but it's the tradition, I guess. And suddenly Colvin admits his feelings of compassion for Namond, and all of a sudden Cutty sits up and then sort of strains his back, so it's quite a fun moment. And
agrees to obviously put him in touch with Weebay. Yeah,
he suddenly gains respect for him. And then, of course, Colvin has that great moment where he sort of explains to the nurse how she's really sort of prejudiced Cutty in an unjustified way. And that has an interesting payoff in the montage that we'll get to.
Yeah, it does, yeah. So that's Namond then.
Yeah, Namond and Colvin. That's all done. So we're quickly going to go over the politics. There's not a lot of politics this episode. So Carcetti watches a news report about the exhumed bodies and discusses the political implications with his staff. Norman remarks that the bodies are attributable to the Royce administration, and Andy, the new chief of staff, that states that the silver lining of the story is that it draws attention away from the massive school deficit. Andy counsels that they should use this as cover to avoid dealing with the deficit, as it would hamstring Carcetti's plans to run for governor, and that Carcetti will have the funds to address the city's education problems when he becomes governor. Wilson is disappointed to see that Carcetti is willing to trade fulfilling his responsibilities as mayor with increasing his chances of becoming governor. At home by the Christmas tree, Carcetti discusses his options with his wife Jen. She tells him that she believes he will do the right thing. Later, Wilson and Carcetti return from a second meeting with the governor. Wilson is enraged that Carcetti could not swallow his pride to rescue the school system. Carcetti is angry that the governor was going to call a press conference belittling him if he took the money. Andy consoles Carcetti again, telling him that he can do more good as governor himself. Wilson meets with Coleman Parker in a bar. He confides his disappointment in Carcetti, and Parker tells him that all politicians disappoint. Wilson asks who Parker is working with next, and he says that he may stay with Royce or back a young politician.
So we've talked before how Steindorf is kind of like the devil on the shoulder of Carcetti.
Yeah.
And obviously providing him with very particular advice here in order to steady his potential as the governor. I do hesitate to call Norman an angel, but he's as close as it gets in the political world, and is trying to steer him a little more towards what he seems and what he thinks is right, going for these kids in these schools.
I'd forgotten that Norman actually did take a bit of a disliking to Carcetti by this point, because he maintains loyalty throughout and never voices that to Carcetti's face. But it is interesting to see that Norman really does have some high aspirations for what politics should be, and again, Carcetti's disappointing.
I can only guess that first and foremost, Norman is a campaign manager. So he's there to kind of help people win and to provide the messages and the ideas that allows people to capture the hearts and minds of the electorate. But when it comes to the actual running of office, that perhaps the idealism of running a campaign and the messages you're trying to bring and the ideas that come out of doing the right things to capture people's votes doesn't directly translate to the running of office. And this is why he expects the continuation of these great things from Carcetti, who is now being... I think we've mentioned before how Steindorf is a bit of a corrupter for Carcetti and does drag him towards that state house in a rather questionable manner.
But as Coleman Parker says, it's not Carcetti, and it probably isn't Steindorf either. It's just the fact of being a politician. The system is there to kind of mislead you and set you off the path. So you can't really... Well, you can blame Carcetti, but I'd say that the issue is so complicated.
It is nice, that meeting of the two right-hand men, if you like. Yeah.
And you sense that obviously Coleman is a campaign man through and through, as was Wilson, but because Wilson and Carcetti probably really bonded over their campaign, perhaps, Wilson decided to stick around long term, become a political advisor, which is a bit outside his comfort zone, and as we saw, a little bit naive, because he assumed that Carcetti could maintain what he promised on his campaign, and that's not really what happens. So,
So there's a couple of little extra bits, isn't there, where we have... there's a very small bit where Carcetti is kind of asking Jen for advice.
Yeah.
And her response kind of echoes that of rules later on when he's talking to Daniels about doing the right thing.
That's right.
And Carcetti sees this as kind of rather unhelpful as well. He's not usually being told to do the right thing. I suppose he's used to hearing these new commands from Steindorf about what is gaining political capital.
Yeah. It's sort of saying you're the one who's qualified to make that decision. And it is an odd, because we haven't seen Jen for a while, but she really is sort of more challenging than normal here.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that she does seem like she is seeing this change in Carcetti as well.
Yeah.
Which I suppose she would. I mean, husband and wife.
It's always hard to say what she's thinking, but her face certainly does suggest that she's becoming more and more frustrated with him, So yeah, Cutty, distraught, tried to do the right thing. System rigged against him. I don't think he can help but empathise, really. And of course, Steintorf sort of comes back and sets a revenge narrative in motion for Cutty. Says you can get back at the governor, you can grab his job in 2 years' time. And just putting more and more pressure on that governing aspiration at the expense of actually, fixing the city.
And this is, of course, after they end up back on that bench again, with some slightly different but equally syrupy Christmas music going on in the background.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? At the place.
It's reminding us of the, kind of, it's almost like as a condescending atmosphere before anyone's even said anything.
Yeah, it's just, again, a very big ironic sort of burst in the context of this show. Definitely. And yeah, I mean, there's that interesting battle that Steintorf and Wilson have at the start of the politics section before they go for the meetings with the governor. And obviously they're fighting for different corners, and Steintorf is saying, take the money, you don't lose votes, 2 years' time you can help the city from Annapolis. So he's convincing himself that helping the city doesn't have anything to do with, being the mayor. You can actually do it later on after you've improved yourself, and it's just constantly finding a way to not put it on yourself. It's not on you, which is what we've seen from lots of the institutions, but just shirking responsibility. And he also very, very sort of evilly says kids don't vote, which is a horribly manipulative thing to say again.
Yeah.
In this context. Just proper devil on the shoulder antics.
Yeah, who cares about kids? They don't vote, and that's that. So yeah, it's a very tough decision on Cutty's part. I think he is being pulled this way and that by the system around him. I think one can definitely argue that he becomes steadily more unlikable because of his decisions, but then one has to consider why he's making these decisions and how he's being tempted by the potential political power in drawing closer to that state house.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And of course the whole thing gets personal because of his his dislike of the governor himself. So yeah, so it becomes this revenge narrative is already in motion. Really, it's kind of almost set in stone now that he's going to be taking the state house. Okay, so where are we heading next?
So we're going to go to the Western District for a fairly small section. So Poot and Bodie visit the site where one of the bodies was found. They have heard that little Kevin's body was found inside. Bodie becomes increasingly agitated about the unjustifiable nature of the killing of his friend. Officer McNulty recognises Bodie when he vandalises a patrol car and is swiftly arrested. McNulty visits the staging area and asks Perlman how many bodies have been discovered. She reports that 17 have been discovered so far. He asks Perlman to sign off on releasing Bodie without charge. McNulty quizzes his colleagues about the case they are building. They taunt him by saying that a real police officer would feel compelled to help them. McNulty waits for Bodie as he's released from jail and offers to buy him lunch. As they leave, Monk arrives with the bondsman and notices Bodie getting into McNulty's car. McNulty takes Bodie to Sylvan Arboretum. Bodie tells him that he is not an informant but admits his frustration with his life as a drug dealer and Marlowe's leadership. He tells McNulty that the game is rigged and that he feels like a pawn on a chessboard. He offers McNulty information to bring down Marlowe. McNulty tells Bodie that he is a soldier.
So right at the beginning we have Bodie kind of making his stand. That proves ultimately fatal, but at this moment you can't help but really like him for it, standing up against this great organisation that is going around killing people as they please, and finally kind of snaps a little bit, and it's kind of interesting that McNulty kind of points out, it's his friend in the bag. It's kind of obviously maybe doing a little bit of classic McNulty as well, as like pointing out how smart he is and how clued in he is with everyone's cases and whatnot.
Yeah.
Maybe hinting at old school McNulty coming back.
Yeah, but I do love that scene where Bodie and Pooh are watching the events unfold with the vacants, and Bodie putting it so nicely that he's just killing just for the sake of killing, and Bodie proudly reaching the end of his tether with this decline in the street morals, as he puts it. And obviously Pooh is voicing his concerns that he's putting himself at risk, and Pooh has always been resigned to working within this system that he's got. He's a little bit more of a less of an independent thinker, and Bodhi's always been a bit more of this smart-ass pawn that he mentions. And it is interesting to think what Bodhi's actually trying to achieve by getting himself blatantly arrested like this. Is it a protest against Marlowe? Or is he just trying to get himself off the streets now that he's done with them, so to speak? He's finished with this game. It's already broken.
To an extent, I suppose it's completing our trio of outbursts. Well, it's not even a trio. There's more than that. I suppose Colvin has a bit of an outburst as well. But certainly it goes in hand. We have Carver get angry inside a car, and we have Bodhi getting angry to the exterior of a car. And I guess we can couple this with Bubbles and Wayland behind the glass. Colvin having a bit of an outburst with Parenti after their meeting. So it's just kind of that there's a lot of things coming to a head, a lot of people boiling over in this episode, and I guess this is presenting that. But I did try to think if maybe there was some extra reason going on here, but no, I guess it's just a catharsis for him, and he doesn't care anymore. Unless
he saw McNulty there and thought maybe I could go and chat to this guy, but I'm sure it wasn't. I think you're just reaching the end and not caring is exactly right. Really, that feels a lot more satisfying, and it is convenient nonetheless that McNulty is there in the right place to become even more. Then it kind of becomes a bonding point for them again. They can become even more of a kindred spirit couple in the process. And not that Bodhi's a kid. In fact, this episode refers to Bodhi as an old man in many ways. But there, like the other four kids who have their mentors, they have Prez, Colvin, Carver, and Chris. It does feel like McNulty and Bodhi do occupy a little bit of that territory here, as with the other four.
So as we kind of discussed last episode, it is very obtuse of Bodhi to be getting so publicly friendly with McNulty. First, he was in a diner, which in itself felt risky. Now he's right outside on the street, and not just that, but he's right outside a place where there's likely to be people who are involved in the game, observing him. They're likely to be around that area because it's where he's being released from a house full of them, essentially. So, it's smart-ass pawn he is not at this moment.
Yeah.
And it's not long now until he's knocked out of the game.
There's no denying that he is unlucky. What are the chances, really? It's nice that the whole scene with Monk was set up by Marlowe, though. He told him to go and find the bondsman. It doesn't come out of completely nowhere, because that would feel a bit cheap. But it's still a real big convenience. I like the fact that they at least try to go somewhere private. Obviously, they go to Sylvan Arboretum on the edge of the city, this nice safe haven where no one will catch them together, but oh dear, the damage is done already, isn't it, as you say, and Bodhi pretty much dies when he walks out of the central booking. And in some ways, McNulty kills him. In other ways, Bodhi's kind of receptivity to McNulty kills him, but it is an unfortunate combination.
And perhaps McNulty not fully aware of the ferocity of the new street as well. I feel like
he's been away for too long.
If he'd been really clued into that, he probably himself would have tried to make it more of a quick meeting and to arrange something some other time somewhere else. But instead, I guess he kind of assumes that it'll be okay at this brief moment. And although it is unfortunate, I think Bodhi could afford to be a lot more cautious.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But this does bring us to what is, again, one of my favourites, possibly my favourite actually in this episode, I think. And it brings back our chess metaphor from early season 1 in a big way. And the idea of the pawns and the kings, they're all there. But this time, it's the only other time that it explicitly surfaces the idea in the show. And it's a nice bookend of Bodhi's time on the show, actually, really. Starting with that D'Angelo chess inauguration. So they're kind of sat, obviously, in the middle of this rectangular enclosure. And they've got their food in between them, marking the lines between the side of the law and the lawless. And they're both, obviously, at the front of their respective halves of the board. So they're both the pawns on each side. And there's obviously this statue of the old king of sorts at the end of the chessboard. And sort of the Greek tragedy overtones are there at that, or is it just the king at the end? You know, you could say Marlowe is the king on one side and rules Burrell and Carcetti, or some combination thereof, on the other side. And yeah, it's just really, really nice imagery that's put across fairly subtly, really, to do with the chessboard there.
Yeah, very nice. And the chess analogy doesn't quite stop there. I think we kind of pick it up for one last time for Bodhi's death as well, but we'll cover that in more detail in a bit, I'm sure.
Definitely, yeah. And I guess if we just quickly go over the sort of subject of their discussion, Bodhi practically resigning himself to death, really. He says that he's happy to put in Marlowe, but he doesn't want to live on his knees. So he's kind of saying, I guess I'd rather die than live with this crap any longer, if it means dying for a noble cause. And he's smart enough to know that snitching on Marlowe will get him slaughtered, yet he believes strongly enough in what it would achieve, I guess, that he's practically willing to lay himself on the line for it. Which is it's practically the definition of a pawn, isn't it? It's the pawn-like behaviour.
Sacrificial.
And, yeah, exactly. So all that naivety and the original use of the smart-ass pawn, as he sort of monikered himself, it's really matured into this sort of greater understanding of the world here, which is really nice.
All right, so any more on our sort of Western District bit with McNulty?
Obviously you get some chills when McNulty mentions that he's a soldier. Love that bit. And the tragic discussion of age as well. Like Bodhi just feels so old now. Like he's just existed on these streets for years. Far outlived his life expectancy.
Yes, I was going to say that comparative to a lot of the people that he's worked with, he has been out there a long time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It seems funny to think that we were talking about the long way that the boys have come and, in some extent, have had to become grown-ups in the process, having been forced through these very adult worlds. And Bodhi, perhaps in a much longer period of time, when we consider where we first meet him in Season 1, you were talking before about the introduction of the game with the chess analogy. He's very much come from being a child as well.
Yeah, we've really seen him grow up and mature all at once, really, yeah. Very likeable character.
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely very tragic in that conversation that he has with McNulty, and like you say, you're a soldier is pretty heartbreaking, really. Yeah. That loyalty and that dedication, and even if it is perhaps on the wrong side of the law, it's not being rewarded. And I think that what he's saying about where are they at when things really start to go wrong is very true of all of the institutions in the show.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Unless you are a D'Angelo, if your uncle runs the show, if you are a Valchek or you are a Prez. Otherwise, no one's really going to be looking out for you at all.
Yeah, that kind of sort of family connection can get you those roles, but otherwise you got no protection.
Yeah. All right. So speaking of loyalty or lack thereof, should we move on to the Stanfields? And a couple of sections here. We're going to split this up into two. So Monk reports citing Bodhi to Marlowe and a newly released Chris. Marlowe instructs Chris to have Michael kill Bodhi on the chance of him being an informant. Chris tells Marlowe that Michael worked for Bodhi, so the task should go to someone else. Marlowe relays the latest news about the theft of their shipment and Omar's offer to sell it back to them. Bodhi returns to work on his corner with Poot and Spider. He notices someone approaching in the shadows, and Poot sees someone coming from the other direction. Poot urges him to flee, but Bodhi refuses to run from his own territory. Spider runs, while Bodhi fires into the darkness. Poot makes a final plea and then takes flight himself. As Bodhi is distracted by Chris and Snoop, O-Dog steps from a doorway and shoots him in the head.
So first off, the Chris and Michael connection is showing us a slight similarity to the Colvin and Namond connection, because Chris is actually being quite thoughtful here, which seems uncharacteristic for someone as cold as him. He's considering Bodhi, but particularly Michael as well. He doesn't want to force him into killing someone that he knows. And he's also obviously considering Bodhi because at first he's not completely sold on the idea of killing Bodhi for just having been seen with a police officer. So yeah, it feels like a slightly softer Chris here. It feels like he's been affected by Michael in some way.
Yeah, I think that is a Chris trademark, really, because obviously the Stanfield organisation exists to be the ultimate just brutality and lack of compassion, and Marlowe is the one who provides that, and then obviously Chris gives us flickers of humanity to make it a bit more interesting, and he does that in a lot of situations, and certainly here is one of the stronger ones, as he does try to have some sort of understanding of the emotional trauma of actually becoming a killer. It's clearly something he's gone through himself, and he has to start off on a learning curve and go slowly. And I guess being able to disconnect yourself from the guilt and shame of what you're doing by killing someone is probably the key consideration to actually make it work. And obviously killing someone you know is certainly not a good way to start. So
this is alongside Chris being able to relate to Michael's upbringing as well. We're operating under the assumption that there is some similarities between the two there, and Chris strongly sympathises. So I think there's a particular bond between him and his protege here than perhaps ones that he might have had previous.
Yeah, and that this sort of comment makes you really try and imagine the absolute pain of becoming someone like Chris, who sort of represents the most hardened person. And he's so hardened that he's beyond being scary. He has no need to intimidate anymore, like, say, Cheese. He just takes it like it's a dishwashing or a household chore to go and kill someone, and he has no fear. He's very good at it, but he's just completely reached the peak of what that profession can be, more so than anyone else, and it's a sort of fascinating place to be. So you can ask for a better mentor if you want to be a killer.
So let's take a look at our Bodhi death scene then.
By the way, did you catch that Prop Joe had said that Omar was buying it back for 30 on the dollar rather than 20? So still got a little trick up his sleeve.
Oh right, yeah. There's kind of the con extends that little bit further.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, yeah, the big scene, the death of the season, as it were.
So it seems I was saying earlier that the chess analogy continues a little further, and I think we may have mentioned somewhere before that we have a kind of literal physical thing going on with the chessboard here, and you've mentioned it already, that it's been done with the arboretum that they end up with, and these kind of divisions between the two sides of the board, and having McNulty and Bodhi presented as pawns. Here we have Chris and Snoop almost like bishops, approaching diagonally, sort of attacking diagonally onto the corner to where Bodhi is stood. We also have O-Dog coming out the side of the house like a knight, going forward and then moving to the side in the way that a knight moves on the chessboard, again to attack Bodhi to finish him off. Now, it's also worth noting that Bodhi can attack diagonally, so you can kind of return fire towards Chris and Snoop. But not side to side, which is why he's not able to combat, or certainly in this analogy, is not able to combat O-Dog. He also can't run away, because pawns can't go backwards, they can only go forwards or side to side. And in this analogy, I'm going to assume that Poot is a rook, as they can move any number of squares backwards, which he does very swiftly.
That's a very good
So
point,
it feels like the chess pieces are being conveyed very literally here, and it's really powerful. I think it's a really wonderful way of presenting it. Just brilliant.
And I think for someone who has, who hears that and is like, you're just kind of making something of nothing.
I'll go back and watch that scene.
If you go back and
really
watch
obvious.
it's really, really like pronounced. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really pressed on. I really don't think that's an over-analysis. More than enough people have discussed this before, certainly I'm sure over the internet and the like. And this is definitely just the rounding off of that chess analogy, and the pawn being obliterated in the end, being highlighted as ultimately the weakest of the pieces. Yeah.
And is it so Chris and O-Dog are knight? So Snoop and O-Dog are knights, right? Because they sort of do the sidestepping and then the forwarding. Is that right?
Well, I see it as you have Snoop and Chris approaching diagonally from either side, which is why Bodhi is kind of going from diagonally from side to side to kind of fire to keep them away. but ultimately you have O-Dog coming out of a door, so going forward a little bit, and then going further left to approach Bodhi, which is like a knight's manoeuvre.
Definitely.
And
It was interesting
L-shape.
how... Yeah, no, it's certainly true. It's interesting how, because obviously Chris starts on the opposite corner, so he moves literally diagonally, very smoothly over. And then Snoop sort of sidesteps around vehicles to take cover on the way there. So I don't know if she's knighting as well, but they certainly come from like the two diagonal angles to distract Bodhi. Very masterfully organised operation.
Yeah. And like I say, it's appropriate that he doesn't run away because pawns can't do that. They can't go backwards.
Yeah. Unlike the rook. Yeah, that's very, very true. And of course there is, this scene also has a little bit of a following in terms of Michael confusion, because a lot of people think that it's Michael that comes out here and kills Bodhi. Obviously, Chris has already told us that he doesn't want to do that with Bodhi. He doesn't want him to kill his old boss. And I can feel for people, because obviously O-Dog does look fairly similar to Michael, particularly when his hood's up like this. But I'm glad it isn't Michael who does this, because it would be a bit of an anticlimax from that character's point of view, I think. It's good that he has his own moment later on to make that first kill, that real big leap.
Yeah, it doesn't try to push too many tragedies into one scene.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
So yeah, it's definitely O-Dog.
And we see Bodhi, maintaining his new sort of philosophy on life. He's got nothing left to lose as far as he's concerned, and he's sort of dying with the ultimate pride here, defending what he loves and what he knows.
And true to the training as well, he gets that second headshot.
Yes,
to guarantee that he's down, as we've seen in the training that they had with Chris and Snoop.
Yeah, brilliant. Everything's very consistent. Okay, should we quickly move on to the second half of the Stanfield?
Yep.
I wanted to sort of separate the Bodhi death into one thing, so we could sort of just deal with that, because it's a very, very important scene. So Marlo, Chris and Snoop visit Michael at home. Marlo questions him about the ring he wears around his neck, and Michael reports that he took it from someone. Marlo is shocked, having had the ring stolen from him by Omar several weeks ago. Michael offers to give him the ring. Dookie descends and offers to ready Bug for school. Marlo tells Michael that he's putting him in charge of Bodhi's corner, and that he has another task for him. Snoop asks Michael who they killed for him, and he reveals that it was Bug's father. Michael kills a drug dealer in a close-range shooting, as Chris and Monk look on. When Michael gets into the car, Chris tells him that he should look his victims in the eye.
Yeah, so we have this rather intimidating arrival at home. Maybe a little bit surprising that they all go together into Michael's home. I don't know, maybe that isn't unusual, but it seems like the sort of thing they don't normally do. They don't normally congregate inside in that way.
There's a lot of power in one home there. The scene where it actually completely mirrors for me, the scene where they all visit Namond's house before school, the three kids. I think the camera's set up in exactly the same way. So instead of Michael, Randy and Dookie coming in, it's Snoop, Chris and then Marlo at the end.
But Dookie doesn't get let in, does he?
This
is at Namond's house, is it? Yeah, Delonda stops him at the door, isn't she?
Yeah. Yep, that's true. So it's just the two of them. But clearly there's now a new, much more scary bunch of people in town coming through the door. And it really shows you how close to home Michael's operation is, really, with Milo. And
speaking of Dookie, I'm sure that's very intimidating for him as well.
Yeah, he just sort of runs straight back to the kitchen, doesn't he? Finds some excuse to get himself out of there. And of course it makes sense that Marlo set him up with this crib, as we find out, something that I didn't really think of last week. But of course Michael couldn't really afford a place otherwise, so it makes sense. So he, to some extent he has people looking out for him. Not that they really have necessarily his best interests in their minds, but they have some sort of way of life set out for him.
They want him to be sustainable for them, not for himself.
Yeah.
And obviously they assign this first task, the first murder, which he must pass on. We're not given any information about it. We don't know what it is that he's got to do until we see it, although it is fairly obvious. But we don't know why he's killing this person. It's just some nameless drug dealer in a sort of point-blank killing. And that's it. That's the deed done. He gets back in the car, and now, Chris is telling him that he's proved himself as he's able to stand up and stand tall, and he's not a child anymore. He's a true killer now.
And as you said before, Chris always manages to put that interesting layer of humanity onto things when he mentions that he has to look them in the eye. Particularly the way we see him through the rearview mirror as well. That seems to add a bit more gravity to it. And I don't know why. I guess you have to confront the fear of what you're doing to overcome it, perhaps. But it really makes it a lot more scary when you hear these tips that are being let off by Chris here. It's really quite fascinating in many ways.
Yeah, quite a bizarre humanizing of a horribly dehumanizing act.
Yeah, very weird, isn't it? And of course, Michael's now got his promotion. He's now sort of a crew chief, and he's got the points on the package that comes with that. So
a career Stanfield now.
Yeah, he's going to be
for the time being, anyway.
Yeah, and I love the way Marlowe delegates that in the house. Just the way he explains what he's going to be doing next. It's both relaxing and terrifying at the same time, because he sort of speaks with such a withdrawn, hushed tone. So it's just, sort of real mindfuck stuff. And of course, we didn't mention the ring.
That's right. Yeah, this is, I suppose, the end of the end of sort of its movement, as it kind of like is recognised by its not its original owner, its original taker.
Yeah, the original taker.
As having come this far, and I guess he can only assume that he took it. He perhaps thinks that he took it from Omar. Maybe it's hard to tell exactly what he thinks, but he seems impressed either way.
Yeah, and I love how Michael describes the acquisition of the ring in exactly the same way that Marlowe did to Andre when he first took it. He just took it. There was no elaborate economy behind it, because obviously Andre was trying to find some sort of words to hide behind here, and there's obviously a very no-nonsense attitude that both Michael and Marlowe share.
Yeah,
and
clearly
Marlowe
got respect for that.
Seems to really dig that when he mentions that he just took it. He just took this ring. That's it. Even though it was Michael, there's a whole story behind it, but Michael's distancing himself from that sort of thing.
Similarly, he ain't much for sentiment.
Yeah, there's certainly some similarities there. Okay, any more on the Stanfields?
No, I think that's about it. I suppose there must be, before we do our montage, I suppose we've got what's left of McNulty's sort of moments.
Yep, and then we're going to just quickly go and see Omar Part B as well.
The last part of our Omar.
Yeah, they're both very short. So McNulty, Carver reports Bodie's death to McNulty as he arrives for work. McNulty rushes to read the report and throws the sheet across the room in despair. McNulty searches Poot at his corner and asks him who killed Bodie. Poot refuses to offer him anything beyond blaming the murder on the police for talking with Bodie. McNulty lets him go. McNulty discusses Bodie's murder with Beadie in bed. He tells her about the new major case investigation, and she immediately realises that he wants to get involved. McNulty tells her that he feels that he owes it to Bodie. He speculates that he will be different with less vices and anger now that he is with Beadie. McNulty meets with Daniels to request the transfer. Daniels asks if he is certain, and McNulty tells him that he's optimistic about his ability to keep himself separate from his work. They make a joke of strategy for the case.
As we've already mentioned, we've learnt from The Wire that characters talking introspectively and looking at how much they've changed from the past and looking forward to their future is usually the point at which something horrible happens with them, and we see, he's going to keep away from himself, and this kind of optimism goes quickly down the plug hole, as in Season 5. He becomes a sort of super McNulty, I think.
Yeah.
Hyper McNulty, perhaps.
He becomes the most McNulty he's ever been, in a really, really hard-to-watch way, really. It's so frustrating to see that when you first turn on Season 5. He's completely back in this whole...
Is it the sort of Jimmy McNulty version of going Super Saiyan or whatever it is.
Yeah, and it makes that scene with Beatty, which is quite a nice scene. Again, one of those we always mention the domestic scenes for their rarity and for for the value they offer beyond the police work and the professionalism of the gangsters and stuff. But it is a hard to watch scene. Just like you can kind of feel what's the disintegration that this is going to lead to, and it's hard to say if Beatty. I think Beatty does trust him because obviously she hasn't really seen any of the bad sides of McNulty. McNulty's really kept a lid on things throughout their relationship so far, and yeah, it's going to turn pear-shaped.
We do get a bit of a repetition of that conversation from the very first episode. I mentioned already that's more than one allusion to our very first episode, The Target. And Daniels and McNulty obviously kind of straight up mirror this conversation about wanting things to be fast and clean and simple, and now Daniels is obviously going for the wiretaps instead, and him repeating McNulty's obnoxious line about, oh, then you don't do it at all. So yeah, it's kind of nice to get that echo of the first episode.
Yeah, it's the season 1 redo. There's certainly some real emotion here, and makes you realise as well how much Daniels respects McNulty for what McNulty has actually done almost as much to help Daniels get where he is than he has done to impede him as well and to piss him off. Like they're kind of balancing the scales really when you actually think about it, because for half of season 1, Daniels did not understand the value of wiretaps. He was very much focused on bringing the cases in and satisfying the bosses, and it was only when he was allured by what could be discovered when you actually had to bring a case home. Obviously the judge was being very insistent and they had to push harder, something had to move, and Daniels suddenly got the bug for the wiretap, and that's completely changed his whole moral outset within the police force, and he's now this force for change, the carte blanche of the investigative unit and the rest of it. So yeah, really, really good to call back to that. Very emotional for me to hear as well, and I don't know how obvious it is. Obviously, if you only watch the show once, I'm not sure you'd even remember that conversation at all. So I think it's one of the things they've left for the rewatch, certainly.
Oh yeah, I think if you remember that from the first episode, if you're watching The Wire kind of through, imagine watching it when it was on TV for the first time. There's just, if you remembered that, then you've got an incredible, certainly much better memory than me. So it's definitely hidden in there for the value of those who are going to be watching and rewatching.
Yeah, and of course, I guess it's McNulty at his most functioning, when he is in bed with Beatty. I think that conversation is the most honest one he ever has, sort of in the show, and it is really nice to watch. As I've said, there's a real bittersweetness to it, but it's worth mentioning that that's kind of the ultimate high. And McNulty goes through a lot of peaks and troughs, but that really is the ultimate.
Yeah, and so it only seems fitting that it's right before a big fall.
Yeah, the biggest fall. All right.
So
okay,
our last Omar bit then.
Really quickly, yeah. So Omar returns to his hideout having met with Joe and received payment for their stolen shipment. He gives Butchie a percentage for himself and tells him that he will now act as his own bank. Omar leaves the shipment in a locked garage and calls Joe to advise him. As he leaves, Butchie warns Omar that the theft will have further repercussions.
And Butchie's comment about being "this ain't over" is a message to the audience as much as anything.
Yeah, it's an oddly ominous thing to say as Omar hops off on his retirement with Ronaldo. Obviously, there's heaps of foreshadowing within it. That's the point, but it feels like the moment is a bit too optimistic to really necessarily have some foreshadowing. But it's certainly worthy because Butchie actually has probably the most visibly brutal death on the show in like 3 episodes' time. So I guess it serves a purpose, and it makes sense.
Further repercussions indeed.
Definitely, yeah. And it makes sense that with all the money they've got, even more value than the actual drugs themselves. Obviously, they've got 20 on the dollar from what they got. They'd go on retirement. That's pretty much them set for a long time, and they're off to Puerto Rico, we find out later on, where potentially Ronaldo is from, I imagine. I'm not sure. But yeah, won't last for long, of course.
All right, so that brings us to our our
chapter close.
montage, yeah, our sort of classic end of season musical number, along with a sort of roundup, wrap up, ready for some transitioning, ready for the next season.
Yeah. So let's quickly go through each beat very quickly. So Weebay tells Namond that he is still his father and passes him into Colvin's custody. McNulty is welcomed back to Major Crimes, where Michael is already on the board. Herc faces an internal investigations trial board where he appears to fear for his job with the words "conduct unbecoming" heard from the investigators. Vondas and Joe meet under Marlowe's watchful eye. Parenti presents his findings to academics, but a disgusted Colvin walks out during his presentation. Bunk briefs the homicide unit on the vacant murders. Landsman is distraught at the state of his board. Daniels and Perlman eat lunch with Carcetti, while Burrell and Davis look on. Prez tracks Dookie down, working on Michael's corner with Putin Kennard. Randy finds his money stolen and is beaten by his roommates. Cutty shows the newly adoring nurse his gym. Carcetti suffers through a budget meeting. Carver moves a group of children on from Randy, Dookie, Michael and Namond's old hangout. Michael tutors Bug. Chris rouses Michael and has him throw the gun into a storm drain. And then we have our sort of final scene. Namond is sent to a new day of school by Colvin and his wife. As he readies himself, he sees Donut in yet another stolen car, and they share a nod. Donut drives away, and the street is peaceful again.
Yeah, an awful lot being crammed into that montage. It really is packed with how characters have moved on or not moved on. A lot of sort of things staying very much the same and dealing with similar problems. It's Paul Weller doing a cover of Dr. John's Walk on Gilded Splinters in the background.
Yeah. Possibly the best of the montage songs, actually. Very, very good.
It is very good, yeah. I also feel like this is perhaps the most packed montage. There's so many scenes.
There's just a lot to cover, isn't there, really?
I mean, I suppose we can kind of... don't know if we can really go into detail about every single one. That they are all very short.
I mean, the montages are always very self-explanatory, really, aren't they? It's very clear what they're conveying at the end of each arc, as it were. So I haven't got a lot to say about each one, really.
I did think that you have Landsman kind of inspecting his homicide's whiteboard, and it does look to me like the whiteboard with the names on it, and it's kind of been extended below on a bit of paper, doesn't it? It kind of looks
that's right. Yeah.
It kind of looks like the whiteboard has gained a tie. And that this is another one that Landsman would like to sort of follow the great homicide tradition of cutting people's ties off. I think he'd like to cut this one off as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
It does look like a sort of necktie hanging from the whiteboard.
A real purposeful tie. Because obviously he had a massive list in Season 2. I think there was it 14 Jane Does on the cargo container? And now we're up to 22 with the vacant murders. So, yeah, poor Landsman. He always gets the bad stats. I thought that the Dookie Prez section was one of the most interesting, and obviously you have Kennard spitting on him for sort of stopping without buying, and Dookie obviously having sort of stopped drifting around and sort of settling down with something vaguely constructive, and there's not much else but the corner to turn to, really. And as you say, Prez perhaps really feeling guilty that he perhaps shouldn't have listened to Donnelly's advice and actually taken him more under his wing, but what can you do? He's not really, got legal custody of him at all. And
to slay us one last time at the thought of that peaceful summer, we have Carver returning to the old hangout and seeing the graffiti on the wall with all the names of the kids. The Lafayette crew
the Lafayette
or whatever.
Mafia crew or whatever.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, that's a real Boys of Summer moment, isn't it? Definitely, yeah. Yeah, it feels like it's been a hell of a long time. It's been like 3 months for us, I think, hasn't it, going through this? So it has been a while, and a lot has changed. And obviously the 4 boys have been through lots. They've each had their mentor, some who have stuck by them, some who haven't. We have Michael and Namond, whose mentors have stuck by them, Chris and Colvin. And then we have Randy and Dookie, whose mentors have dropped out of supporting them. Obviously Prez went voluntarily, whereas Carver went sort of with a fight. So interested to see how that's panned out over the season.
So what do you think of the this kind of last bit that we have right at the end? I mean, obviously we see Namond seeing Donut, and we have two sides of the coin there. We have one of the kids who has made this massive progress and finally realised and accepted who they are and has been fortunate enough to take it into a new home and is living a far more peaceful life. And then on the other hand, we have Donut, who has learnt nothing and gone nowhere and is pretty much exactly the same position that he was in when we first met him. Obviously, this is an interesting and poignant statement for the show to be making, although it does feel like a bit of a coincidence for them to see each other in that neighbourhood just before Namond is about to go to school or whatever. So
we're clearly in a nicer neighbourhood, aren't we? We're beyond the western ghettos.
So it's not. It feels perhaps a tiny little bit contrived, but it's an interesting point being made.
Donut may well have known where he's living now. I mean, they may have stayed in vague contact. So maybe, perhaps he was just doing a drive-by. It's hard to tell if their communication is sort of hostile or friendly. It could be either way, considering the situation that Namond is now in. Potentially much to the jealousy of the others around him, and potentially much to the sort of... Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard to maintain relationships with the streets when you're in such a sort of sheltered family environment like that. So...
And what do you think of this very final shot where we have our peaceful crossroads? We're just kind of left with that lingering for a few seconds before the credits themselves.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? It's a light-hearted finish. Obviously, Donut has brought a lot of the light-heartedness to it, but they do dwell on this final... It's a good sort of half a minute almost of just this tranquil, domestic, functioning district, and they prove it. They show you a dad with his hand on his kid's shoulders, he's sort of walking him across the road to school. This district is clearly cared for by those who live there. And it's perhaps suggesting at the aspirations of what the season's been trying to show you. And yeah, I mean, obviously we're seeing that one of the only success stories at all. They do exist, but they're very rare, and most people won't be able to experience them. But it's just a little snapshot of the other side of the coin, and the show has loved to show us mostly the worst side of that coin, really.
So anything else to say about our sort of closing chapter of season 4?
No, that's the... I think that's the recap as well, really. Have you got anything else to say in general, really, about the season or the episode, or?
Nothing that we shouldn't take a look at in our title and epigraph bits.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's worth mentioning, obviously, back in... more than a year ago when we did the pilot episode, we mentioned how the pilot is the worst rated or the least rated episode of the Wire on IMDb, whereas this is the most strongly rated episode of the whole show.
Is it really?
So it is, I believe, yeah. So I think that's probably fair. I think I might have to agree with them on that front. It just packs so much emotion into it. And what's the biggest feat with that is that the show never tries to be emotional. There's no sentimentality at all, or almost none. And it's just because they've spent so much time building up the relationships here that it all comes so naturally, completely. There's no music to help us out. It's all just completely emotional climaxes done as naturally as they can be done, in a really effective way. So, yeah, I think it totally deserves its top ranking on the Wire bookshelf.
It is as though the show is not trying to feel that emotion for us or present that emotion for us. It just leaves us up to us to interpret these scenes. And when they are deeply upsetting, there's no denying that there's going to be a fairly universal reaction to it. And like you say, the lack of incidental music, which is not to say that the use of diegetic music is always, it would be terrible for me to say that diegetic music in these instances is always going to be harmful to the overall emotional effect of it. But certainly with a show like The Wire and the content that it has, the lack of music in these situations is important in kind of keeping that straight face of the show, keeping a kind of hard-nosed, critical eye, but as unbiased as possible. And like I say, not trying to present these emotions to us, just letting us take in the show as it is in an almost documentary-esque fashion.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Personally, I am... I think maybe Margin of Error might tip it for me. I know this is a brilliant conclusion. I don't mean to take it away from final grades at all, but I do really like Margin Error as well. I think that's such a powerful sort of mid-season finale, as it were.
It's weird because I do agree with you essentially, as we both agreed, didn't we, during Margin of Error, that it was the best episode. Clearly, temporarily, it's been switched because I just watched this recently, but I have always maintained as well that I think what that episode achieves individually is the best of all the episodes, really. So, yeah, very good point.
Right, so let's move on to our final sections then, for the last time for Season 4.
But I gotta tell you, we're not gonna get Marlowe, Stanfield, or anyone else above the street, not on street reps.
What do you suggest?
Either a wired CI or Title III. That's what makes this case.
You sure? Maybe you do this fast and clean and simple.
Then you don't do it at all.
Chain of command, Colonel.
So the title of this episode, Final Grades. Quite a literal title. I think,
Good title.
What did you think of this title and how it ties into our episode and maybe the season as a whole?
So it's lots of, obviously the literal referring is to the test grades that the students get and the fact that they're all duked, basically. And I guess there's lots of things that are up for evaluation here. Parenti and Colvin's pilot program. You've also got the bodies, which are in Royce's name because New Year is not here yet, which is good for Carcetti. Puts final grades down on Royce, but that's all in the past, so it doesn't really matter. Also, Michael is obviously facing his first test here, and Chris seems fairly pleased with his progress, but obviously asks him to improve himself by making sure you look them in the eye and all the rest of it.
O-Dog as well, who was in training not so long ago.
Yeah, that's true. So it's all there, and it feels like Bodhi ties in as well with final grades somehow. There's just that finality to it, I guess. What about you? Have you got any other linkages that you've...
Yeah, I mean, it just makes you think of in terms of final grades, of like grading the final situations of the kids that we started off with. Michael's a murderer and deep in with the Stanfields. Dukie's a dropout. I mean, he is at least currently helping Bug, but is essentially on a fast track towards being another Bubbles, essentially.
Yeah.
And being a drifter, like you said before. Randy is lost to the group home and is very much drowned in that world. As we've seen, only Namond has really ended up in a positive, fortunate situation. There's also Donut and Kennard, who were kind of like accessories to the core four, but they're both pretty much exactly as they were when we first met them, just more seasoned. Yeah. So in terms of final grades, you're kind of seeing as grading the final stages of where these kids are at and the transition that they've made.
Yeah. I mean, as we were doing earlier, we were trying to grade who was the most tragic of the kids and all the rest of it. So, I mean, it all ties in, certainly, yeah.
And what about our epigraph? This one's a bit difficult. Obviously, I'm sure that those of you listening have noticed that when we have two quotes from the episode in every podcast, and the first one will usually just be some random one that I pick offhand, one I happen to like, or just one that I've randomly picked from the episode, and then the second one in between the recap and the final sections will always be the epigraph. Unfortunately, I couldn't do one for this week because it's not spoken in the show. It's obviously a sort of just the sign on the wooden doors. If animal trapped, call 410-844-6286.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's some sort of code hidden in that number as well. But
I believe at the time the number was a number that worked.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I think it was a number that gave like the local Baltimore time or something.
Oh, right. Fair enough.
So obviously this is printed on all the doors that we see that have been nailed closed. And we've seen it appear several times before on various wooden panels, even before this season.
Oh yeah, it's been a very common feature of the streets, isn't it?
And now the most obvious connection that one can make is that a lot of our characters are obviously trapped in their positions, trapped in institutions, trapped by their circumstance. A lot of characters realising, coming to terms with, or being killed by the fact that they have been backed into their situation and have nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to go. They just it seems that only Namond is the person who has been truly freed by this good fortune, and someone who has actually been saved by the system. And it does happen,
Yep.
but it really is 1 in 100.
And I think it also makes reference to the fact that so many institutions are off the mark and they're just not seeing what they need to see, and these door warnings are acting like, look here, there's the stuff you need to see is here, but people are missing it. And there's sort of obviously that doesn't work literally because they're literally RSPCA warnings or whatever, but there's sort of an element of that, just missing the mark and being a bit dysfunctional and not seeing what's good for them. They're missing the point. And yeah, it's an interesting epigraph.
I would also say that in relation to the bodies that Chris and Snoop have put behind some of those sort of wooden panels, is that is the dehumanizing effect as well, that they are being treated like animals and disposed of in kind of really, really cruel ways. And I mean, I wouldn't even dispose of an animal in that way myself, but it is kind of just perhaps pressing the dehumanizing aspect of it and the cold ferocity of the new street.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. That's really nice.
So anything else that you want to chip in for this episode as a whole, or our epigraph, or season 4 in general?
Worth mentioning that, Waylon, who is played by Steve Earle, it's funny how he's got the cover of one of his own albums, Copperhead Road, patched onto his jacket.
Oh, so really?
If you're looking for a little meta Easter egg, there's one for you.
Oh, nice. And of course, he goes on to do the season 5 theme, which we'll be hearing next week.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, and he becomes a fairly prominent character in that season, so we'll look forward to all that very shortly.
I guess that's it then. That's season 4.
Yeah. Yep.
What a roller coaster! I mean, this is, as we said right at the beginning, and I think as we've said many times throughout, this is obviously our favourite season, and what a ride it's been. And it doesn't pull any punches. The Wire's not showing any signs of slowing down, and it's unrelenting demonstration of the post-industrial American city, and it's really getting tough even with the kids here. So it's been a tough watch, I think, and it's not going to get much easier in season 5 as most these kids end up even further down the darkest paths.
Oh yeah, it doesn't really even get easier with the rewatches, does it? It sort of maintains its power as you go through. So yeah, we've done 50 out of 60. To put it into perspective, we're close to the end.
Which I guess just leaves us to say thanks very much for everyone who's been getting in touch with us, and everyone who's been enjoying the season so far. And unbelievably, here we are, coming up to the very final season, and just 10 episodes, of course. So that was this episode here, episode 13, season 4, is the second longest episode of the whole show, with only the actual finale beating it out on that one. So
proper feature length, isn't it? It's like 92, 93 minutes, so that's going to be a real...
Yeah, that'll be fun.
behemoth to get through, yeah.
But yeah, thanks once again for joining us. We've had a great time doing this season, and we hope that it continues into season 5, which will be starting as usual next week. Do join us for that, and do send in your thoughts on season 4 and this episode in general for anything that we can read out in next week's episode. Until then.